"You are cruel and selfish for stopping my son from having everything he wants," my mother-in-law hissed, her gaze piercing into me. In that moment, surrounded by laughter and the sizzle of the grill, a storm brewed within me. My response when it came was a clap of thunder, revealing a secret that would change everything. I always believed that love could conquer all. That's what fairy tales taught us, right? But standing in our cozy living room, adorned with photos of David and me in happier times, I realized some battles were more formidable than others. As I gently dusted the picture from our wedding day, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow for the family we had dreamed of but couldn't create. David was in the kitchen, humming a tune that used to make me laugh. Now it was a bittersweet melody. He knew, just as I did, the pain of our unfulfilled dream. We had been trying to conceive for 3 years. The doctors had been clear about my condition. With only one functioning ovary and polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, the odds were stacked against us. I remembered the night I told David about my fertility issues. We were just a few months into our relationship, but I knew he was the one. The look in his eyes was not pity, but determination. He held my hands, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together, Anna. There's more than one way to build a family." His optimism was a balm to my worried heart. Yet as years passed, with every negative pregnancy test, a part of that hope faded. Tonight, we were hosting a family dinner. David's family, particularly his mother, Mrs. Harper, was unaware of our struggles. Each time she asked about grandchildren, a small part of me crumbled. I couldn't bear to tell her the truth, that her son might never be a father because of me. As guests started arriving, I pasted on a smile and greeted everyone warmly. David's mother walked in with her usual flair, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for something or someone missing. "Anna, dear, this is lovely, but you know what would make it lovelier? The laughter of a little one running around," she said, her voice loud enough for others to hear. I felt David's hand tighten around mine, a silent message of support. I managed a weak smile. "Maybe one day, Mrs. Harper." The evening progressed with laughter and chatter, but the unspoken words between David, his mother, and me hung heavily in the air, a reminder of the dream that remained just out of reach. The sun cast a warm glow over our backyard as I tended to my garden, a hobby that had become my sanctuary from the world. The flowers didn't ask questions or pass judgment. They simply flourished under my care. I often wished life could be as straightforward as gardening. The sound of David's car pulling into the driveway snapped me back to reality. It was Saturday, which meant another family gathering, another chance for Mrs. Harper to ask the question that twisted my heart every time. "When will you give me grandchildren?" I loved David's family. They were boisterous, lively, and close-knit. But Mrs. Harper's relentless probing about our plans for children was a constant source of tension. David had suggested telling them about my condition, but the thought of exposing such a personal part of our lives made me uneasy. I wasn't ready for the pity or the well-meaning but often ignorant advice. At the gathering, the atmosphere was lively as usual. David's cousins were there with their kids, running around, their laughter echoing through the house. I watched David with them, his face lighting up in a way that both warmed and broke my heart. He would have made an amazing father. Mrs. Harper approached me as I was helping myself to some iced tea. "Anna, I don't mean to pry, but you're not getting any younger. David needs a child. He's so good with them," she said, her tone a mix of concern and accusation. I felt a familiar surge of frustration. "We're just not ready yet, Mrs. Harper," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. She looked unconvinced, her lips pursing in a disapproving line. "Well, I just hope you won't wait too long. David deserves to experience fatherhood." Her words stung like a slap. I wanted to scream, to tell her that it wasn't by choice, that every month brought a new wave of disappointment and grief. But I held back, nodding politely before excusing myself. Later that evening, David found me sitting alone on the porch. "She doesn't mean to hurt you," he said gently, wrapping an arm around me. "I know," I whispered, leaning into his embrace, but her words cut deeper than she realizes. As we sat there, watching the sunset, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer we could keep our struggle a secret, and what would happen when the truth finally came out. The family barbecue at David's parents' house was in full swing when we arrived. the scent of grilling burgers mingled with the laughter of children playing in the yard. I tried to appear cheerful, but inside, I was dreading the inevitable comments from Mrs. Harper. David squeezed my hand as we walked through the garden, his silent way of saying, "I'm here with you." He always knew how to calm my nerves. As the afternoon progressed, I found a quiet corner to sit and observe the festivities. David was playing with his cousin's baby, a sight so tender it brought tears to my eyes. He was a natural, cradling the baby with such ease and love. Then I heard her voice dripping with insinuation. "You are cruel and selfish for stopping my son from having everything he wants," Mrs. Harper whispered harshly, standing beside me. Her words hit me like a physical blow. The pain, frustration, and anger I had bottled up for so long boiled to the surface. I turned to face her, my voice cold but steady. "Well, we seem to have different opinions on that. I think it's cruel and selfish to cheat on your husband and the father of your 2 children with his best friend, kick him out, and move your bid on the side in 2 weeks later. But that's just me." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Mrs. Harper's face paled, her eyes widening in shock. Around us, the chatter ceased as our confrontation drew attention. I hadn't planned to reveal her past indiscretions, but the words had tumbled out in a moment of raw emotion. The family's reaction was immediate. Some looked away uncomfortably, while others whispered among themselves. Mrs. Harper burst into tears, turning to flee the scene. The family quickly rallied around her, their disapproving glances directed at me. I felt like an outsider, a villain in their eyes. David rushed over, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. "Anna, what happened?" he asked, his eyes searching mine for an explanation. I shook my head, unable to find the words to justify my outburst. I couldn't take it anymore," I murmured. As we drove home, the car filled with a tense silence. David finally spoke, his voice tight with emotion. "I'm furious with my mom for what she said, but you crossed a line, Anna." I understood his disappointment, but couldn't bring myself to apologize. The hurt from his mother's words was still too raw, too deep. "I know, and I'm sorry it came to this. But I can't apologize to her." "Not yet," I said quietly, staring out the window at the passing scenery, feeling more alone than ever. The days following the barbecue were filled with an uneasy silence in our home. David was torn, upset with his mother for her hurtful words, but also disappointed in my reaction. I, on the other hand, was wrestling with a tumult of emotions. Guilt for my outburst, yet a sense of justification for standing up for myself. I spent long hours in our garden, tending to the flowers, but my mind was elsewhere. The words I had hurled at Mrs. Harper replayed in my mind, each time slicing through me with a fresh wave of remorse. I hadn't meant to air her dirty laundry, but her constant jabs about my infertility had pushed me to my breaking point. One evening, David joined me in the garden. The air was cool, and the sky was painted with hues of orange and pink. We sat on the bench, the silence between us heavy. "Anna, we need to talk," David began, his voice hesitant. "I know my mom was out of line, but what you said—" I cut him off, my voice trembling. "I know, David. I'm sorry. It's just her words hurt me so deeply. It's like she thinks the only value I have is in bearing children." David took my hand, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. But we can't let this tear us apart. We're stronger together." The conversation that followed was raw and emotional. We spoke of our pain, our fears, and our hopes for the future. David reassured me of his unwavering love and support, irrespective of whether we had children. It was a balm to my aching heart. The next few weeks were a period of reflection and healing. I started seeing a therapist to help me navigate my feelings of inadequacy and anger. It was during these sessions that I realized the depth of my internal struggle with infertility and its impact on my identity and self-worth. David and I also began attending couples therapy. It was a space where we could openly discuss our feelings and work on strengthening our bond. We learned to communicate better and support each other more effectively. Despite the progress we were making, the rift with his family remained. David continued to visit his parents, but I couldn't bring myself to face them, not yet. I needed time to heal and to find the strength to face Mrs. Harper again. As days turned into weeks, I started to understand that while I couldn't control what others said or thought about me, I could control how I reacted and how much power I gave their words over my life. It was a slow and difficult journey, but one that I was determined to walk, for the sake of my peace and for the love I had for David. The world continued its usual pace outside, but within the walls of our home, time seemed to move differently. The rift with David's family cast a shadow over our daily lives, a reminder of the unresolved tensions and the hurt that still lingered. David went to visit his family regularly, but I stayed behind, the thought of facing them, especially Mrs. Harper, still too daunting. In these moments of solitude, I found myself reflecting on everything that had transpired. One afternoon, while lost in these thoughts, my phone buzzed with a message from my sister, Laura. She had always been my confidant, the one person who understood me without judgment. "Coffee? My treat. You need a break," her message read. Gratefully, I accepted her invitation. Meeting Laura at our favorite cafe felt like a breath of fresh air. As we sipped our lattes, I poured out everything that had happened, the words tumbling out in a rush. Laura listened intently, her eyes filled with empathy. "Anna, you're stronger than you realize. And sometimes standing up for yourself means people get hurt. It's not ideal, but it's also not your burden to bear their reactions to your truth." Her words were a comfort, offering a perspective I hadn't considered. It wasn't just about forgiveness or who was right or wrong. It was about understanding my worth and not allowing others to diminish it. "Maybe it's time to start thinking about what you want, not just what is expected of you," Laura suggested gently. Her advice lingered in my mind in the days that followed. I realized that I had been so caught up in trying to meet others' expectations that I had lost sight of my own needs and happiness. With Laura's encouragement, I began exploring activities that brought me joy. I joined a local book club and started attending yoga classes. These small steps helped me regain a sense of control and normalcy in my life. However, the issue with David's family was like an unfinished chapter looming in the background. I knew I couldn't avoid them forever. One evening, I broached the subject with David. "I think it's time I try to mend things with your mother," I said, the words feeling heavy but necessary. David's face lit up with relief and hope. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured." "I'm sure," I replied. "It's not just for you or your family, it's for me too. I need to find closure, one way or another." We planned a small dinner at our house, just David's parents and us. The thought of facing Mrs. Harper again was daunting, but I knew it was a necessary step towards healing and moving forward. As the day approached, I felt a mixture of anxiety and resolve. It was time to close this painful chapter and hopefully start a new one. The day of the dinner arrived, and our home was filled with the delicious aromas of the dishes David and I had prepared together. It was a simple menu, but each dish was made with care, a silent testament to our hope for reconciliation. As the doorbell rang, my heart raced. David gave me an encouraging smile before opening the door. His parents stood there, his father with a tentative smile, and Mrs. Harper, her expression unreadable. The initial greetings were polite, if somewhat strained. We sat down to dinner, the conversation skirting around safe topics like the weather and David's job. But the elephant in the room was palpable. As we were finishing dessert, I took a deep breath and turned to Mrs. Harper. "I wanted to say something," I began, my voice steady despite the nervousness I felt. "What happened at the barbecue? I'm sorry for what I said. It was out of line, and I let my emotions get the best of me." Mrs. Harper looked at me, her eyes showing a mixture of surprise and something softer, perhaps a hint of understanding. "I was hurt by what you said, but I also realize I pushed you too far with my comments. I'm sorry for that," she replied, her voice quavering slightly. David and his father watched the exchange, a sense of relief visible in their eyes. It wasn't a perfect apology from either side, but it was a start, a crack in the wall of tension that had built up between us. The conversation that followed was tentative but genuine. Mrs. Harper asked about my interests, and for the first time seemed genuinely interested in my life beyond the prospect of grandchildren. I talked about the book club I had joined and my newfound love for yoga. She listened, nodding, and even shared some of her own hobbies. It was a small bridge, but it was something. As the evening came to an end and David's parents prepared to leave, Mrs. Harper paused at the door. "Anna, would you like to join me for a gardening workshop next weekend? I think you might enjoy it." I was taken aback by the invitation, but pleased. I'd like that, I replied with a genuine smile. After they left, David wrapped his arms around me. I'm proud of you, he said softly. I leaned back against him, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it felt hopeful. We had taken the first steps towards healing and understanding, opening the door to a future where, regardless of what it held, we would face it together. The day the tornado hit, I was at work, my mind buried in mundane tasks, unaware of the chaos brewing at home. It was a typical spring day in our small town, the kind where the weather can't decide between sunshine and storms. When my phone rang, displaying my neighbor's number, I felt a spike of unease. Emily, you need to come home now, her voice trembled. It's your house, the tornado. My heart sank. I rushed through the emptying streets, the sky a menacing shade of gray. Turning onto our street was like entering a nightmare. Trees uprooted, power lines down, our neighborhood looked like a war zone. And there, standing defiant yet wounded, was our home. The sight of it brought a lump to my throat. Windows shattered, the roof partially torn off, our beloved home was a shell of its former self. But it was still standing. That was something. Thankfully, no one was home when the tornado struck. My husband, Mark, and our 2 kids were safe, which was all that truly mattered. But as we stood there, surveying the damage, I felt a sense of loss for the life we had built within those walls. We spent the next few hours salvaging what we could. Our neighbors, true to the spirit of our tight-knit community, rallied around us, offering help and support. In the midst of this chaos, there was a sense of unity, a shared resolve to rebuild not just our home, but our lives. That evening, we found temporary refuge at my sister's house. Exhausted, I finally had a moment to sit down and check my phone. It buzzed relentlessly with messages and missed calls. As I scrolled through, one particular notification caught my eye. It was a Facebook post from my mother-in-law, Linda. The post was dramatic, to say the least, claiming our house was completely destroyed. I felt a surge of irritation. Linda had a penchant for exaggeration, especially on social media, but this was a new low, even for her. Can you believe this? I showed the post to Mark, who let out a weary sigh. She just doesn't get it, he said, his voice a mix of anger and resignation. She knows I hate it when she posts about our personal life. The post had already gathered a string of comments, people expressing shock and sorrow, offering prayers and help. It was a kind gesture from the community, but based on false pretenses. I wanted to correct the post, to set the record straight, but Mark placed a hand on my shoulder. Let's just deal with it tomorrow, he said. We've got enough on our plate right now. He was right, of course. But as I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I couldn't shake off a growing sense of anger. Linda's actions, though perhaps well-intentioned, had crossed a line, and I was determined to make her understand that. The morning light did little to ease the heaviness in my heart. As I scrolled through the endless messages on my phone, Linda's post from last night glared back at me, a stark reminder of the unwanted drama unfolding alongside our real crisis. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, I pondered my next move. Mark, ever the peacemaker, suggested letting it go, focusing on our immediate needs instead. But the more I thought about it, the more Linda's actions bothered me. It wasn't just about the post. It was about respect, privacy, and understanding boundaries. I decided to call Linda, hoping a direct conversation might resolve the issue. The phone rang, and after a couple of tones, her cheerful voice filled the line. Emily, darling, how are you holding up? I've been so worried. Linda, we need to talk about your Facebook post, I said, cutting to the chase. There was a pause on the other end. Oh, that, she replied, her tone shifting. I was just trying to let our friends and family know what happened. Gather some support for you all. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. Linda, our house wasn't destroyed. It's badly damaged, yes, but your post is misleading. And Mark specifically dislikes personal matters being shared on social media. There was another pause, longer this time. Well, I didn't mean any harm, she said defensively. I just wanted to help. I softened my tone. I appreciate that, Linda, but this isn't the way. Can you please correct the post? People are worried unnecessarily. There was a reluctant murmur of agreement from her before we ended the call. I felt a small victory, but the irritation lingered. I couldn't shake off the feeling that Linda's actions were more about garnering attention for herself than genuinely helping us. The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls and arrangements, insurance agents, contractors, family members offering help. In the midst of it all, I kept thinking about Linda and the impact of her thoughtlessness. It was a small part of a much larger problem, but it felt symbolic of the lack of understanding and respect that had always tinged our relationship. That evening, as we gathered at my sister's house for a makeshift dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to the Facebook fiasco. My sister, always the outspoken one, didn't mince words. "You should give her a taste of her own medicine," she said, half joking. "See how she likes it when her personal business is all over the internet." Her words, meant in jest, sparked an idea in my mind. A plan began to form, one that would teach Linda a lesson in a way she wouldn't expect. It was risky, potentially petty, but at that moment, it felt like the perfect response to an ongoing problem. The next day dawned with a sense of purpose for me. As I surveyed the damage to our home once more, I couldn't help but think about the unnecessary chaos Linda's post had caused. The more I reflected on it, the more it felt like a symptom of a much larger issue in our relationship with her. She often overstepped boundaries without considering the consequences, and this time I was determined to make her realize the impact of her actions. Meanwhile, the ripple effect of Linda's exaggerated post continued. Mark's aunt, who had taken the post at face value, had shared her own version of the story, further distorting the truth. This led to a cascade of concerned calls and messages, adding to our already overwhelming situation. Mark, seeing the stress it was causing, finally agreed that something needed to be done. "I just don't understand why she always has to make things about her," he said, frustration evident in his voice. As we sat in the living room of my sister's house, surrounded by a few salvaged belongings, the reality of our situation hit me. We were in the middle of a crisis, yet part of our energy was being drained by a needless social media drama. That evening, I started to put my plan into action. It was simple, yet effective. I would give Linda a taste of her own medicine by sharing a post about her on Facebook. But not just any post. It would be a carefully crafted story, exaggerated just enough to make a point, yet harmless enough not to cause real damage. I spent some time composing the post, ensuring it was just right. "Feeling grateful for Linda," I began, "who bravely saved a stray cat during the storm and is now nursing it back to health at home." It was a complete fabrication, of course, but plausible enough to be believed. I hesitated for a moment before hitting post. This was not my usual style, but desperate times called for desperate measures. I thought about the stress her post had caused us, and with a mix of apprehension and determination, I shared the story. Within minutes, the post started to gain traction. Comments poured in, praising Linda's heroism and kindness. I watched as the notifications flooded in, a part of me feeling guilty for stooping to her level, yet another part feeling a sense of vindication. The following day, Linda called, flustered and overwhelmed by the attention the post had garnered. "Emily, I don't know what to do. Everyone is asking about this cat, and I don't even have one." I tried to keep my voice steady. "It's overwhelming when people share things about you on social media, isn't it?" There was a long pause on the other end. I see your point," she finally said, her voice a mixture of embarrassment and realization. It was a small victory, but an important one. Linda had finally experienced firsthand the impact of her actions. It was a lesson in empathy, delivered through the very medium she couldn't resist. The aftermath of my Facebook post was immediate and revealing. The phone call with Linda had ended on an awkward note, but it sparked a necessary conversation. Later that day, she came over to my sister's house, a rare gesture of humility in her eyes. "I didn't realize how my actions affected you and Mark," Linda began, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a hint of vulnerability. "I never intended to cause you more stress." I appreciated her effort to understand, but years of accumulated frustration bubbled to the surface. "Linda, it's not just about the post. It's about respecting our privacy. Mark has told you many times he doesn't like personal things shared on social media." Linda nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. "I guess I got carried away with wanting to be a part of everything. I didn't think about the consequences." The conversation that followed was long overdue. We talked about boundaries, respect, and the importance of communication. For the first time, I felt like Linda was truly listening, not just hearing what she wanted to. Mark joined us, and together, we began to untangle the complicated web of our family dynamics. It was a difficult conversation, filled with moments of tension and relief, but it was necessary, a step towards understanding and healing. As Linda left, she turned to me. "Thank you for the eye-opener, Emily. I promise to be more thoughtful in the future." The confrontation had been cathartic, but it left me with mixed feelings. My plan had worked, but I couldn't shake off the guilt of using deception, even if it was for a good cause. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. We began the arduous process of repairing our home, buoyed by the support of our community. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a sense of purpose and determination. In the midst of the chaos, I often found myself reflecting on the confrontation with Linda. It had been a turning point, not just in our relationship with her, but in how I viewed conflicts and resolutions. I realized that sometimes it takes a drastic measure to bring about change, but the real challenge lies in handling the consequences with grace and understanding. As we slowly put our home and lives back together, I felt a newfound sense of resilience. The tornado had taken much from us, but it had also given us something unexpected, a chance to rebuild, not just our house, but our relationships and ourselves. In the days following the confrontation with Linda, there was a palpable shift in our family dynamics. The air was clearer, albeit still tinged with the remnants of past grievances. Linda's visits became more considerate, and our conversations more meaningful. Yet a part of me remained wary, unconvinced that old habits could change so quickly. As we navigated through the complexities of rebuilding our home, I found myself mulling over the effectiveness of my little plot. It was a tactic I was not proud of, but it had sparked a necessary change. This realization led me to reflect on the concept of revenge. Was it always a negative impulse, or could it, in some contexts, be a catalyst for positive change? I discussed these thoughts with Mark one evening as we sat amidst boxes of salvaged belongings at my sister's house. "I keep thinking about what I did with that Facebook post," I admitted. "Part of me feels guilty, but another part feels like it was the only way to get through to your mom." Mark took my hand, his eyes understanding. "I know it wasn't easy for you, but it did make a difference. Sometimes we need to shake things up to make people see things differently." Encouraged by his words, I started to view my actions in a different light. Revenge, in its many forms, is often seen as a petty or destructive force. But in this case, it had served as a mirror, reflecting the consequences of one's actions back at them. This perspective became a source of strength for me. As we worked through the endless tasks of restoration and dealing with insurance claims, I found a newfound assertiveness. I was no longer hesitant to speak my mind, especially when it came to decisions about our home and family. Linda, for her part, seemed to have taken the lesson to heart. Her interactions with us became more thoughtful, and she was noticeably more restrained on social media. It was a small, yet significant change, one that improved the overall atmosphere whenever we gathered as a family. During this period, I also learned the importance of forgiveness. Holding on to anger and resentment was like carrying a heavy burden, that one that I no longer wished to bear. Forgiving Linda did not mean forgetting what had happened, but it allowed me to move forward without the weight of past conflicts. As our home slowly came back to life, so did our spirits. The process of rebuilding was not just about repairing walls and roofs, but about mending relationships and redefining boundaries. The storm had brought destruction, but in its wake it left room for growth and renewal. The reconstruction of our home progressed steadily, a tangible symbol of our family's resilience. With each repaired wall and repainted room, I felt a sense of accomplishment and hope. This period of rebuilding was not just physical, it was emotional and relational as well. My plan, which had initially been born out of frustration and a desire for revenge, had unexpectedly opened a path to healing and understanding. Linda's transformation, though gradual, was evident. She became more mindful of her words and actions, showing a level of consideration that was previously absent. One weekend, as we were unpacking some boxes in the newly restored living room, Linda dropped by, unannounced yet welcome. She came bearing a homemade cake, a small but significant gesture. We sat around the kitchen table, savoring the cake and the comfort of easy conversation. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Linda began, her tone reflective. "I realize now how much I've overstepped in the past. I'm sorry for the stress I caused you both." Her apology was sincere, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was the closure I hadn't realized I needed. "Thank you, Linda," I said, meaning every word. "It means a lot to us." As we talked, I saw a new side of Linda. She listened more than she spoke, her responses thoughtful and considerate. It was a stark contrast to the Linda I had known, the one who always seemed to be at the center of every conversation. This change in Linda had a ripple effect on our family dynamics. Mark and I found ourselves looking forward to her visits, appreciating her efforts to be a better mother and mother-in-law. Our conversations delved deeper, moving beyond surface-level pleasantries to genuine discussions about life, dreams, and fears. In these moments, I realized the power of communication and empathy. My initial plan, conceived in a moment of frustration, had unknowingly paved the way for a deeper connection. It was a reminder that sometimes the most challenging situations can lead to the most profound transformations. As our home neared completion, so did our journey of reconciliation and understanding. The experience had taught us the value of patience, forgiveness, and the strength of family bonds. We had weathered the storm, both literal and metaphorical, emerging stronger and more united. With our home fully restored and our family relationships on a new, healthier trajectory, I took a moment to reflect on the journey we had undergone. The once damaged walls of our home now stood strong and vibrant, echoing the transformation within our family. Linda's evolution was the most remarkable. The once overbearing and intrusive mother-in-law had become a thoughtful and considerate part of our lives. Her change was not just in her actions, but in her understanding of us as a family. She respected our boundaries and became an integral, positive force in our lives. This transformation was not lost on our extended family and friends. They noticed the change in dynamics, often commenting on the newfound harmony at family gatherings. It was a testament to the power of communication and the willingness to change. As for me, the entire ordeal had been a profound learning experience. I had confronted a challenging situation with a plan that, in retrospect, was risky and could have backfired. But it had led to a positive outcome, teaching me the importance of standing up for what I believed was right, albeit in a non-conventional way. I shared these reflections with Mark one evening as we sat in our rejuvenated living room. "I never thought that a plan born out of frustration would lead to such a positive change," I mused. Mark smiled, taking my hand. "Sometimes it's the unexpected paths that lead us to the best destinations. I'm just glad we've come out of this stronger as a family." The incident with the tornado and the subsequent fallout with Linda had brought us closer together. It had shown us the strength of our bond, the resilience of our family, and the transformative power of empathy and understanding. Our home, once a symbol of loss and chaos, had become a haven of love and unity. It stood as a reminder that out of destruction can come growth, and out of conflict can come harmony. We had not only rebuilt our home, but had also restructured our family dynamics into something stronger and more meaningful. As I looked around at the walls that had witnessed so much, I felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude. We had weathered the storm, and in its wake, we found a deeper appreciation for each other and the home we shared. I sat in our living room, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, had just told me over the phone that I wouldn't be joining the family trip. "You'll be staying home because it's not enjoyable when outsiders are around," she said with a tone that stung. As she mentioned something about bringing back souvenirs, her voice dripped with sarcasm. The call ended abruptly, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I looked around, feeling out of place in the house that was supposed to be a temporary refuge. When David and I married, I never imagined that living with his parents would be so challenging. But after our apartment got damaged, his mother, Eleanor, insisted we stay with them. At first, it seemed like a good idea, but I quickly learned that her kindness was a mask for her controlling nature. Every day with Eleanor was a test of patience. She had a way of making me feel small, questioning my every move, from how I cooked to how I cleaned. It was exhausting, trying to live up to her standards, knowing I would never meet them. And David, he just stayed quiet, caught between us. I remember how different things were when David and I first met. We worked together and slowly became friends, and then more. He was different then, more assertive, more present. But living with his parents changed him, or maybe it just showed a side of him I hadn't seen before. I always knew that Eleanor preferred her son over anyone else, but I never thought it would affect me this way. I tried to fit in, to be the daughter-in-law she wanted, but nothing seemed to work. The more I tried, the more she pushed me away. Now, sitting here, feeling like an outsider in what was supposed to be my home, I realized that something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, always feeling unwanted and unappreciated. As I put away the suitcase I had started to pack for the trip, a sense of determination filled me. Eleanor may have won this round, but I wasn't going to let her dictate my happiness. I had to find a way to stand up for myself, to show that I wasn't just an extension of her family, but a person with my own worth. As I put away my suitcase, I couldn't help but think back to how different life was when David and I first met. We worked at the same company, in different departments, but our paths crossed often. It started with casual conversations by the coffee machine, which turned into lunches, and eventually, dates. David was charming, kind, and he made me laugh. It was easy to fall in love with him. We got married 3 years ago, and at first, our life together was everything I had hoped for. We had our own apartment, and we were building our life together. But then, an unexpected fire in the neighboring unit turned our lives upside down. Our apartment was damaged, and we were suddenly homeless. That's when Eleanor stepped in. "Why don't you two stay at our place?" she had offered. It seemed like a good solution at the time. David was relieved, and honestly, so was I. But I didn't realize the price I'd have to pay for that help. Living with David's parents was challenging from the start. Eleanor had always been polite, but once we moved in, her true colors showed. She criticized how I did the laundry, how I cooked, even how I decorated our room. It felt like she was constantly watching and judging me. David, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to it all. He was happy to be back in his childhood home, and I think part of him enjoyed being taken care of by his mother again. I tried to talk to him about how I felt, but he just didn't see it. "She's just set in her ways," he'd say, or, "You know how moms are." But Eleanor wasn't just any mom. She was a mom who made it clear I wasn't good enough for her son. Despite the tension, I tried to make the best of the situation. I thought that if I could just prove to Eleanor that I was a good wife, a good person, she would accept me. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Her house, her rules. Looking back, I wonder if I was naive to think I could win her over. Maybe I should have pushed David harder to move out, to find our own place again. But I didn't, and here I was, stuck in a house where I wasn't wanted, preparing to be left behind while they all went on a family trip without me. As I closed the closet door on the suitcase, I realized that this was more than just about a missed trip. It was about finding my place in this family, or maybe realizing that I never would. I needed to figure out what my next move was, for my own sake. Sitting alone in the house, I began to reflect on the escalating tensions with Eleanor. It wasn't just the snide comments or the constant criticism. It was the way she made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home. My efforts to be a good wife and daughter-in-law seemed to vanish into thin air. Never enough to please her. I thought back to the countless evenings spent in silence after another of Eleanor's remarks. Sometimes it was about how I arranged the living room or the way I spoke. Other times it was more personal, like questioning my career choices or why David and I hadn't started a family yet. Each comment was a subtle jab, reminding me that I wasn't living up to her standards. David's reaction, or lack thereof, hurt the most. He always seemed to find a middle ground, trying not to upset either of us. But in doing so, he often sided with his mother. I understood his difficult position, but I couldn't help feeling abandoned. "She's just worried about us," he would say, trying to justify her behavior. But it felt like a betrayal every time he failed to stand up for me. I kept myself busy with work and household chores, partly to avoid confrontation and partly to prove my worth. I worked part-time at a local supermarket, a job that Eleanor deemed unambitious. But I liked it. It gave me a sense of independence and a break from the tense atmosphere at home. Yet, no matter how hard I worked or how much I tried to keep the peace, it was never enough for Eleanor. Her house was her kingdom, and I was merely an unwelcome guest. It was a constant struggle, trying to maintain my identity while being overshadowed by her presence. I remember one particularly harsh weekend. I had just finished cleaning the entire house, a task that Eleanor usually criticized. Expecting another round of complaints, I was surprised when she walked in and said nothing. I thought maybe, just maybe, I had done something right. But then, as I sat down with a cup of coffee, she appeared out of nowhere. "Jessica, your cleaning is too sloppy. You need to spend more time on it and put some gratitude into it for your hardworking husband. As his wife, it's your duty to support him." Her words stung, and I felt my efforts crumble under her scrutiny. I tried to argue, to defend myself, but it was useless. Eleanor had made up her mind about me, and nothing I said or did would change that. It was a lonely feeling, being in a house full of people yet feeling utterly alone. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, I realized how much this situation was affecting me. My confidence had taken a hit, and I was constantly second-guessing myself. I knew something had to change, but I wasn't sure what or how. I just knew I couldn't keep living under Eleanor's shadow, constantly trying to prove myself to someone who had already decided I wasn't enough. I had to admit, the idea of a spa getaway with David had initially filled me with a sense of excitement, a chance for us to rekindle our relationship away from the pressures of his family home. We discussed destinations with soft giggles and whispered dreams, circling dates on the calendar that promised a respite from the cold reality of our daily lives. But my optimism had been a delicate bubble, one that Eleanor effortlessly popped with her intrusive demands. She transformed our intimate plans into a family excursion to celebrate her anniversary with George, David's father. My heart sank when David, caught in his mother's excitement, echoed her sentiments, claiming that a family trip would be just as enjoyable. The promise he'd whispered to me, that next time it would be just the two of us, felt fragile in his earnest reassurances. I agreed, though reluctance weighed on every word, and I threw myself into the trip's preparation, hoping that my efforts would at least be seen and appreciated. I delved into the organization with an energy that surprised even me. Perhaps deep down, it was an attempt to regain some control over a situation that had swiftly slipped from my grasps. I chose the sights we would see, the food we would taste, and the bed where we would lay our heads, quietly taking solace in the small victory that Eleanor seemed disinterested in the logistics. The day before our departure was a whirlwind of activity, of lists checked and bags packed. It was with weary satisfaction that I finally allowed my head to hit the pillow, mentally reviewing the itinerary one last time before succumbing to sleep. My alarm's call the next morning was a harsh one, screaming at me to rise and face the day. But when I stirred, the space beside me was empty, and an uneasy feeling curled in my stomach. I called for David, searched the house, and found only silence as my answer. Panic fluttered in my chest as I reached for my phone, trying to quell the fear with every ring. And then Eleanor answered, her voice echoing cheerfully through the line from the road, removing any doubt about what had happened. They'd left, just as simply as that, with no regard for me or the plans we'd made. My protests were met with mockery and a swift click of finality as the line went dead. So there I was, alone with my luggage and a void where my family was supposed to be. I could have crumbled, I suppose. I could have let the sadness drown me. But instead, I laughed, a sound of disbelief and resolve intermingled. I'll show them, I thought, anger and determination giving rise to a sudden plan. I opened my laptop and with a few clicks, booked myself a trip that mirrored the one I was supposed to be on, a room just for me in a luxury hotel I had wanted to visit, a table for one in a restaurant with glowing reviews. I packed my bag with an enthusiasm that felt both liberating and bittersweet. Stepping out of the house, I felt the sun on my face, a gentle encouragement for the journey ahead. I boarded the train, alone and unyielding in my decision to enjoy this time for myself. As the landscape whisked by, I could feel the threads of my former life loosening, the hold of Eleanor's world diminishing with every mile. I would find my happiness, with or without their approval. And if by chance I crossed paths with the family I had thought was mine, I would hold my head high. They might have denied me a place in their trip, but they couldn't take away my spirit or my joy. As the train neared the final station, I wrapped the shawl tighter around my shoulders, partly against the chill of early morning, and partly in anticipation. The solo trip had not been part of my plan, but it now felt like an act of quiet defiance, a reclaiming of my own narrative. I arrived at the quaint tourist town that was meant to be the backdrop of a romantic trip with David. The glaring absence of his company gave way to a newfound sense of independence. I let my whims direct me, browsing through shops lined with handmade crafts, enjoying the rich aroma of local coffee blends, and laughing with street performers that animated the cobblestone walkways. Every sight was seen through a lens of self-discovery, and every experience felt deeply personal. The weight of the agony caused by Eleanor and David's abandonment began to lift, replaced by a lighter, freer sensation that bubbled within me. I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lonely. The day waned, and the evening hues painted the sky, signaling it was time to check into the luxurious hotel I had impulsively booked. I had chosen the best, as a treat to myself for enduring the silent battles at home. As I approached the grand facade, a commotion at the entrance caught my attention. There, among the plush velvet and glinting chandeliers, were Eleanor, David, and George, clearly in distress. I tucked myself behind a decorative pillar, curiosity piqued. Eleanor's voice carried across the lobby, tinged with irritation, wondering aloud why they could not secure a room. Clearly, they hadn't managed to find an accommodation after leaving me behind. David spotted me before I could decide what to do. He called out, a mix of astonishment and guilt flashing across his face as he approached. "Jessica, we couldn't check into the room you booked," he stammered, and Eleanor followed, her face tight with barely contained rage. "Of course you couldn't," I replied with a cool tone I barely recognized as my own. The reservation was in my name, and I hadn't checked in. Without my presence, the keys would remain unclaimed, a simple policy, but effective. Their predicament could have been a satisfying sight, but the joy of their discomfort was overshadowed by a sense of sorrow. This trip was a culmination of the disrespect and disregard they'd shown me since moving into their home. Their petty victory in leaving me behind now seemed like a hollow gain. Eleanor's temper flared as David tried futilely to negotiate with the hotel staff. Ultimately, the sight of them being ushered out by security was more pitiful than amusing. Eleanor vowed to find somewhere better, but her words sounded hollow and desperate. I turned from the scene that was once my family drama and approached the check-in counter, ready for a night of solitude in the peace of an elegant room. With my belongings in tow and my head held high, I stepped across the threshold into the next chapter of my life, one filled with possibilities and untouched by Eleanor's shadow. Turning back was not an option, not now, not after all that had transpired. Checking into the hotel felt like stepping into another world, a sanctuary of luxury and tranquility that seemed almost surreal against the rough fabric of recent events. The room I was escorted to boasted grand windows, an opulent bed, and a balcony that offered a breathtaking view of the setting sun. Alone, I unpacked my suitcase, each article of clothing a reminder of the journey I had embarked upon, both physically and emotionally. I decided to explore the hotel, and as I walked through the elegant corridors, I could feel layers of stress peel off with every step. By the time I returned to the grand lobby, I was transformed, no longer the cast-aside wife, but a woman on an adventure of her own making. As I lounged on a plush sofa, savoring my newfound peace, I overheard a hushed conversation that snatched at my attention. A pair of women discussing a harrowing tale about a nearby hotel with a tarnished reputation. They spoke of thefts, strange noises, and an unsolved mystery of a past guest's untimely death. The details sent a chill across my skin, and I couldn't help but wonder if Eleanor, David, and George had stumbled into that very place in their desperate search for a room. Shaking off the unsettling tale, I made my way to dinner, alone yet content. The meal was sumptuous, each bite an indulgence that soothed more than just hunger. I was celebrating not the dissolution of my family ties, but my resilience, my strength to rise from the emotional quagmire that had threatened to ensnare me. Returning to my room, the night embraced me like an old friend, cocooning me in its velvet quiet. As I prepared for bed, my phone lit up, a call from Eleanor. They had found a room, she crowed, reveling in their small triumph. I bit back a warning about the notorious hotel, my instincts urging caution. But her laughter at my concern quickly trampled any goodwill. "Enjoy being regretful," she jeered before the line went dead. I could have persisted, could have tried to save them from potential peril, but my patience was exhausted. Eleanor had made her bed, and now she'd have to lie in it, be it in a haunted hotel or a bed of roses. I turned off my phone, severing the final tether to the chaos of my old life. That night, as I slept in a bed far too large for one person, I dreamed of freedom, a vast open space waiting for me to fill it with new memories, new laughter, free from the binds of family strife. And as the dawn began to breach the night's darkness, I knew that one chapter of my life had ended, and another was ready to begin. Morning light filtered gently through diaphanous curtains. It coaxed me awake with a gentle warmth, a stark contrast to the cold dread that had settled in my heart the night before. As I sat up, the previous evening's encounter with David and his family, and the later ominous phone call, replayed in my mind. After a leisurely breakfast, I ventured out again to savor this precious gift of solitude and exploration. I strolled through a nearby park, admired the art in a local gallery, and indulged in some light shopping, allowing the simple pleasure of making decisions solely for myself. As the afternoon sun began to wane, I returned to the warmth of my temporary haven. My mind dwelled on Eleanor's last call, the triumph in her voice as she described the hidden gem of a hotel they had stumbled upon, and my suppressed fears about its rumored dark history. I pushed aside the unsettling thoughts and decided to focus on my present, a reality filled with tranquility and escape from familial conflict. That evening, I dined at the hotel restaurant, where the soft tinkling of piano keys filled the air with melodies of serenity. It was there, amidst the quiet chatter of other diners, that my resolve solidified. I would not allow my newfound peace to be disrupted. Retiring to my room, I mused over the journey of self-discovery that had begun quite unexpectedly. It dawned on me how much I had sublimated my own needs, desires, and identity for the sake of fitting into David's family. They had left me behind, but in doing so, they had unwittingly set me free. And then, my peaceful contemplation was rudely interrupted by the chime of my smartphone. It was Eleanor again, her voice unnaturally bright as she told me about their comfortable hotel stay. Despite the shiver that ran down my spine, I kept my tone light as I recommended caution due to the eerie rumors. Her response was laughter, derisive, confident, and steeped in denial. One last time, the dawn of concern tried to rise within me to warn them of potential dangers. But Eleanor's flippant goodbye silenced my compassion. I was done being the woman who worried about those who had left her in the dust with little more than thinly veiled contempt. The sound of my smartphone powering down reverberated through the silence, like a door closing on that chapter of my life. No longer would I be the doormat for Eleanor's self-righteousness or the tension in David's divided heart. It was time to move forward, to find my place in the world where I could bloom unimpeded by the chill of familial disregard. Sleep found me easily that night, and it was deep, peaceful, void of the nightmarish scenarios that had threatened to haunt me. When I awoke, it was with a clarity and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. It was time to leave, not just the hotel, but everything that represented my old life. As I checked out and stepped onto the train home, I knew without a doubt that I was journeying not just toward a place, but toward a future, crafted by my own design. The train ride back to what had been my home brought a cascade of mixed emotions. Despite the serenity I had discovered within myself during the trip, a sense of foreboding loomed over me as the familiar landscape came into view. I was returning to a place where my presence had become a point of contention, and now I was ready to face whatever awaited me. Upon arriving, the aura of the family home felt different, almost charged with an anxious energy. The light that spilled from the windows seemed harsh, a beacon that screamed of tumult rather than the warmth of a welcome. With every step I took towards the door, determination steeled my resolve. "I'm home," I announced, as casually as I could manage, pushing the door open. The reaction was immediate. My presence stirred the occupants into a frenzy of exclamations and finger-pointing. As the noise died down, Eleanor relayed the story of their nightmarish stay in a fearful, breathless torrent. They had spent the night in the very hotel that had been the subject of terrifying rumors, the same one I had warned Eleanor about. When she recounted how their belongings had been stolen, with the hotel staff dismissive and unhelpful, I couldn't help but wonder if their experiences were a direct result of their earlier vanities. David and Eleanor rounded on me, blaming their misfortune on my earlier inaction, their words sharp and accusatory. "If only you had told us more seriously to run," Eleanor seethed, while David's gaze carried the weight of disappointment. The blame was unjust and ironic. If I had been part of the trip as originally planned, we would have all avoided the appalling situation that befell them. When I pointed this out, David's temper flared, and with it came the words that finally broke us apart. "We're getting a divorce," he declared, his face red with anger and frustration. Shock took hold for a moment before I regained my composure. I moved to our bedroom and retrieved the divorce papers that had been, until now, a hidden safeguard, a silent acknowledgement of the potential implosion of our marriage, laying them out like a final gambit. I watched as David's anger gave way to disbelief. "We'll handle this like adults," I stated, the calm in my voice belying the earthquake that had just shaken my world. David's feet were rooted to the spot, unsure, while Eleanor capered around him, emboldened as ever, pushing her dispirited son to cut ties with me. And so, the life I had known with David and his parents crumbled to dust. Before long, the divorce was final, and the page had turned on a painful chapter that had defined my existence for far too long. In the wake of our separation, Eleanor's glee was short-lived. Word of the events traveled through whispers and gazes within the community, tarnishing her image. No longer was she the matriarch of a revered household. She became a harbinger of discord. I packed my things and left without looking back, my heart an odd mixture of ache and anticipation. I accepted the finality of my departure as the house I had tried in vain to make a home faded into the background of my train window view. For the first time in a long while, I was master of my destiny. With the help of friends, I began rebuilding my life in my hometown, starting anew, free from the clutches of an oppressive family dynamic. I embraced my singlehood, reveling in the quiet freedom it brought, freedom to breathe, to exist, to be me without restriction or disapproval. Back in the town where I grew up, I took up a new job, reconnecting with parts of myself that had been long buried beneath the role I had played as David's wife. I was rediscovering who I was, reclaiming the pieces of my identity that had been chipped away by years of servitude to someone else's happiness. For now, marriage was a closed book, set upon a high shelf to be perhaps revisited in the far future. But in the present moment I was content. Content to let the tapestry of my life weave new patterns, ones that held the promise of hope, self-respect, and endless possibilities. The cool air of my hometown was a balm to my soul as I stepped off the train. After the tumult of the past few days, the familiar sights and sounds wrapped around me like a comforting embrace. I had come full circle, returning to the place I had once been eager to leave, seeking new adventures. Now it offered the promise of a fresh start. I moved into a small apartment downtown, a humble space, but it was mine, and the privacy felt like luxury after years under Eleanor's scrutinizing gaze. My new job, secured through a friend's referral, was a role at a local nonprofit, a stark contrast to the part-time supermarket position that Eleanor had looked down upon. In the evenings after work, I would walk along the riverbank, the flowing water mirroring the thoughts racing through my mind. I reflected on my marriage with David and my interactions with his family. There was a time when I doubted my actions, when Eleanor's comments made me second-guess myself. But here, in the solitude of nature, I found a sense of inner peace. I wasn't the woman Eleanor had painted me to be. I was resilient, capable, and now truly free. I reconnected with old friends, and the sense of belonging they provided was restorative. We shared meals, stories, and laughter, a stark contrast to the forced dinners at Eleanor's table. With each passing day, the hurt diminished, and in its place grew a newfound sense of self-confidence. As weeks turned into months, the pieces of my new life fell into place. The job was fulfilling, offering a sense of purpose that extended beyond the paycheck. The work I did mattered, and I felt valued, a stark contrast to the feelings of inadequacy I had endured for so long. Word reached me at times about how things were faring in my old life. David, who had been so determined in his decision to divorce, seemed lost without the woman he had once deemed unworthy. Eleanor's reputation had suffered greatly, and her social circle had dwindled. The schadenfreude I expected it to feel never materialized. Instead, I felt a profound sense of relief that I was no longer entwined in their narrative. My evenings were spent on hobbies that had been neglected, reading books, painting, and attending local theater productions. I dove into these activities with gusto, savoring the joy they brought with a childlike delight I hadn't felt in years. Eventually, the inquiries came. Well-meaning friends and family nudged me towards the dating scene, but I was content to remain single. The scars of my marriage and subsequent divorce had healed, but they had taught me invaluable lessons about love, respect, and most importantly, the strength of my own spirit. So, as I closed the door on the past and looked to the future, I did so with a heart full of hope. The road ahead was unpaved and uncertain, but it was mine to traverse, laden with opportunities yet to be discovered, dreams yet to be fulfilled, and a chance at happiness that was entirely my own. I allowed myself one last look back, not in regret but in acknowledgement of all I had overcome. Then I turned away, striding confidently towards whatever tomorrow would bring, knowing that whatever it was, with my resilient heart and my unyielding will, was ready to meet it head-on. In the quiet of my bedroom, I, Emily Martin, a 36-year-old homemaker, sat reflecting on the years I had spent in this house. The walls, once symbols of love and security, now felt like barriers trapping me in a world of deception and unspoken truths. I had married Michael, a man destined to take over his family's prestigious spa resort. His family's legacy was not just a business. It was a beacon in the hospitality industry, a name synonymous with luxury and exclusivity. Our marriage, initially a fairy tale, began to reveal its cracks when I became pregnant. Michael, always the dutiful son and aspiring business mogul, had little time or patience for the nuances of our growing family. His family's obsession with a male heir to continue the legacy loomed over us like a dark cloud. When I discovered I was pregnant, Michael's reaction was a cocktail of relief and unbridled expectation. "A boy, Emily. We need a boy," he said, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of hope and unspoken pressure. I remember feeling a knot in my stomach, not from the pregnancy, but from the weight of his words. The thought, "What if it's a girl?" haunted my nights, robbing me of my sleep and peace. Throughout my pregnancy, Michael's presence became more phantom-like. His priorities were clear: the resort and its future. My health checkups, the preparations for our child, the emotional roller coaster I was on, I faced them alone. The day we found out we were having a boy should have been a celebration. Instead, it felt like passing an exam, a relief, but not a joy. My successor, Michael had said, a statement more than an expression of affection. His infrequent presence at home was marked by criticisms and reminders of the responsibility I carried. I was more a vessel for the heir than his wife. My health deteriorated under the stress. Morning sickness was my constant companion, often leaving me weak and exhausted. Michael's family upheld a tradition of dining together, a practice Michael insisted on. But as my condition worsened, so did his patience. Dramatic, he called it, dismissing my suffering as an overreaction. The day our son was born was the day my illusion shattered completely. I lay there, exhausted yet elated, holding our baby, a beautiful boy with Michael's eyes. Michael stood there, not with warmth, but with a sense of accomplishment. He did not reach for my hand or share a tear of joy. He was there, yet he wasn't. The first time he held our son, his touch was tentative, as if he was holding his future rather than his flesh and blood. That night, as I lay in the hospital bed, cradling our son, Michael dropped the bombshell. Emily, now that the heir is born, your role is fulfilled. I think it's best if you leave. We can't afford a freeloader. His words, cold and calculated, hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, my heart breaking not just for me, but for the innocent life I held in my arms. In that moment, I realized the painful truth. To Michael, I was never a partner, never truly his wife. I was a means to an end, a step in his plan. As I looked into the eyes of our son, I knew I had to be strong, not just for myself, but for him. I would leave, yes, but not as a defeated, discarded wife. I would leave on my terms, with my head held high. Michael had awakened something in me, a strength I didn't know I had. I would ensure that he regretted the day he underestimated Emily Martin. The hospital room felt colder than usual that night. As I lay there, holding my newborn son, the echoes of Michael's harsh words replayed in my mind. Freeloader, he had called me, a term so alien yet so cutting. I looked down at my son, his tiny fingers wrapped around mine, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. In his innocence, I found my resolve. I wouldn't let Michael's cruelty define our lives. The days following were a blur of paperwork, formalities, and silent tears. My parents, unaware of the full extent of my marital strife, were shocked when I showed up at their doorstep, a baby in my arms and a heart full of sorrow. "Mom, Dad, I need some time," I said, my voice barely a whisper. They didn't press for answers, for which I was grateful. That night, as I lay in my old bed, the reality of my situation began to sink in. Michael had not only abandoned me, but also his son. Days turned into weeks. I found solace in the familiarity of my childhood home, the unconditional love of my parents, and the innocent smiles of my son. Yet beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. I couldn't forget Michael's betrayal, nor could I forgive it. His words had ignited a fire within me, a desire to not just survive, but to thrive, and to make him regret his callousness. I started plotting my course of revenge, each plan more meticulous than the last. My days were spent caring for my son, and my nights in strategizing. Michael, in his arrogance, had underestimated me, a mistake I intended to use to my advantage. It wasn't long before I received a frantic call from Michael. His voice, once confident and commanding, was now tinged with desperation. "Emily, please come back. I didn't realize how hard this would be," he pleaded. I listened, a cold smile playing on my lips. Michael, the heir to a luxury resort empire, was crumbling under the weight of responsibilities he had never bothered to share with me. His pleas for help, his admissions of struggle, were music to my ears. This was the man who had reduced me to nothing more than a freeloader, now unable to cope with the reality of his own life. "Michael, we are done," I said firmly, the finality in my voice unmistakable. "You made your choice, and now you must live with it." I hung up, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. I had drawn the first blood in this silent war, and it was both terrifying and liberating. That night, as I held my son, I made a promise to both him and myself. We would not be victims of Michael's cruelty. We would rise from this, stronger and more resilient. Michael had started this war, but I would be the one to end it. The following weeks were a testament to the strength I didn't know I possessed. Each day with my son was a reminder of what truly mattered, and each night, as he slept peacefully, I crafted my plan to ensure Michael paid for his betrayal. His calls became more frequent, each one more desperate than the last, but they only fueled my resolve. Michael's pleas turned into bargaining, then into threats, as he slowly realized I wasn't going to relent. "You can't do this to me, Emily, I need you," he would say. But his words, once capable of swaying me, now fell on deaf ears. I was no longer the woman he thought he could easily discard. I began to reach out to allies, both within and outside of Michael's influential circle. To my surprise, many were appalled by his actions, their sympathy quickly turning into support for my cause. It was as if Michael, in his arrogance, had underestimated not only me, but the relationships I had cultivated over the years. As the days passed, my plans started taking shape. I knew that to win this battle, I needed more than just emotional victories. I needed to secure my and my son's future. Legal consultations, financial planning, and quiet inquiries into Michael's business dealings became part of my daily routine. Then one evening, as I was putting my son to bed, my phone rang. It was Michael again, but this time his tone was different, broken, defeated. "Emily, I can't do this. The baby won't stop crying, and I don't know what to do. Please, come back." I felt a twinge of pity, quickly overshadowed by the memory of his harsh words and colder actions. "You wanted to be a father, Michael. Now you're learning what it means to be one," I replied, my voice steady. I could hear the frustration in his breath, the clenching of his teeth. "I'll do anything, Emily, please." "Anything?" I asked, a plan forming in my mind. "We'll see." That night, as I lay in bed, I realized that my feelings for Michael had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold indifference. The man I once loved was now nothing more than a stranger to me, a stranger I was prepared to stand against. The next morning, I contacted my lawyer to initiate divorce proceedings. I knew it would be a battle, but I was ready to fight for my son, for our future, and for the justice we deserved. Michael had awakened a side of me I never knew existed, and now there was no turning back. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal appointments, strategic planning, and an unwavering focus on my goal. My resolve had turned into a shield, protecting both my son and me from the chaos that Michael had unleashed in our lives. The divorce proceedings were initiated, and with each step, I felt a sense of empowerment growing within me. Michael's attempts to reconcile were relentless, but they only strengthened my determination. He was no longer the confident businessman who had dismissed me so callously. He was now a man grasping at straws, trying to salvage a situation he had created. One particularly poignant moment came when I had to meet Michael for a mediation session. As I sat across from him, I saw a man broken by his own arrogance. He pleaded, bargained, and even broke down, but the image of him standing in the hospital room telling me I was no longer needed remained etched in my mind. "I'll change, Emily. I swear I didn't realize what I had until I lost it," Michael implored. But it was too late. I had seen the true Michael, and there was no going back. "You've already shown me who you are, Michael. I can't unsee that," I replied calmly. As the legal battle ensued, Michael's true nature became public. His inability to manage his personal life started affecting his professional one. The spa resort, his family's legacy, began to feel the strain of his distracted leadership. Then came the day of reckoning. The divorce was finalized, granting me full custody of our son and a substantial alimony settlement. Michael's reaction was one of disbelief and despair. He had lost not just his wife and son, but also a significant portion of his wealth. But the final blow came from his own family. Disappointed by his actions and the negative impact on their business, they decided to remove him from his position at the resort. His fall from grace was not just personal, but professional as well. Michael, once a man of influence and power, was now struggling to find his footing. He tried to reach out, to appeal to my emotions, but I had moved beyond the reach of his words. As I watched Michael's descent, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. He had underestimated me, treated me as a mere stepping stone in his path. Now, he was paying the price for his arrogance and insensitivity. With my son by my side and a newfound strength within me, I stepped into a future of possibilities. Michael's downfall was not just a victory for me. It was a lesson in resilience and the power of standing up for oneself. The closing of the courtroom door behind me felt like the final note in a long, tumultuous symphony. As I walked away, holding my son's hand, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The battle with Michael was over, and I had emerged not just victorious, but transformed. In the months that followed, I established a new life for myself and my son. We moved into a modest but cozy home, a place where laughter replaced the echoes of past arguments and tears. Each room was filled with the promise of a new beginning, a sanctuary from the storms we had weathered. My days were busy but fulfilling. I re-entered the workforce, finding a job that not only supported us but also brought me a sense of accomplishment and independence. The gap in my resume as a full-time homemaker did pose challenges, but my determination and newly found confidence helped me overcome them. As I watched my son play in our new living room, his giggles a balm to my once weary soul, I realized how much we had both grown. He was no longer the silent witness to a crumbling marriage, but a happy, thriving child, basking in the love and stability of our new life. Michael, on the other hand, became a distant memory, a chapter in my life that was closed and shelved away. The last I heard, he was doing odd jobs, a far cry from the luxurious life he was once accustomed to. His family, having disowned him, no longer provided the financial safety net he had always relied on. There were moments of guilt, fleeting shadows of what was once compassion for the man I married, but they were quickly overshadowed by the memory of his words and actions. Michael was no longer my responsibility, nor my concern. Life had taught me a harsh but valuable lesson, the importance of self-worth. I had learned to stand up for myself, to demand respect and fairness in a relationship. This journey, fraught with pain and betrayal, had led me to a place of strength and peace. My son's laughter brought me back to the present. I joined him on the floor, building a castle out of blocks, each one representing a piece of our new life. As we played, I made a silent promise to him and to myself to cherish this happiness, to nurture it, and to never let anyone take it away from us again. In this new era of our lives, we had found not just peace, but a deeper, more resilient joy. We were no longer just survivors, we were thriving, building a future filled with hope and endless possibilities. I'm Elizabeth Martin, a 45-year-old marketing manager. My life, though busy and sometimes challenging, has always been fulfilling. I work for a well-established company, and despite the occasional high-pressure situation, I find deep satisfaction in my work. My husband, Richard, is a kind man at heart, but his priorities have always been a bit skewed. From the beginning of our marriage, he's shown a peculiar devotion to his sister Eleanor and her daughter Sophie. At first, I tried to be understanding. Family is important, after all. But as years went by, I began to feel more like an outsider in my own marriage. Eleanor, Richard's older sister, has been a constant presence in our lives. She's a single mother to Sophie, a lively teenager. Richard often involves them in our plans, sometimes even prioritizing their needs over ours. I've grown used to the last-minute cancellations of our plans because Eleanor needed something. I remember the early days of our marriage when I tried to voice my concerns. Richard would listen, but his actions never changed. I gradually stopped complaining, realizing it was a battle I couldn't win. In a way, I empathized with Richard's sense of obligation. Eleanor had supported him financially during his college years, a fact he often recounted with a mix of gratitude and guilt. Eleanor's story was no fairy tale either. She married young, but soon found herself in a difficult marriage. Her husband, more interested in his career, wanted her to be a stay-at-home mom. When she finally divorced, her financial situation became strained. Richard stepped in as the supportive brother, something I initially admired. But admiration can slowly morph into resentment when the scales are too unbalanced. Our life together was peaceful, yet I often felt alone. Richard's idea of a weekend well spent involved dining out with Eleanor and Sophie, leaving me behind with my thoughts and a quiet house. The turning point came 3 months ago. Richard approached me one evening with a grave look on his face. "Eleanor's getting a divorce," he said, his voice laced with concern. "She's decided to keep custody of Sophie." I knew Eleanor's marriage was rocky, but the news still caught me off guard. Eleanor, with her sharp tongue and haughty attitude, was difficult for me to be around. I recalled our first meeting at Richard's family home, where she had openly mocked my appearance and taste. No one, not even Richard, had come to my defense. Richard's next words were like a punch to the gut. "I'm going to be spending more time at their place," he announced. "Unlike you, Eleanor is delicate. She needs me." His words stung, but I swallowed my pride and simply nodded. Arguing would only push him further into Eleanor's arms. "Take care," I said, forcing a smile as he left. His absence grew more noticeable. Weekends became a solo affair, and even weekdays were spent alone. I'd return from work to an empty, dark home. The loneliness was suffocating. Then, one day, Richard was unexpectedly at home when I arrived, but the atmosphere was anything but welcoming. "You haven't given Eleanor a housewarming gift yet," he accused. "You're getting a bonus soon, right? Buy her something nice, like a designer bag." I was stunned. "Why should I be the one to give a gift? Why don't you do it, Richard?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He became irate, lecturing me on family values and obligations. The conversation left me emotionally drained and deeply hurt. Richard's family seemed to be his only priority, and I was merely an afterthought. A few days later, my phone rang. It was Eleanor. "You heard from Richard, didn't you?" It's normal to give a housewarming gift, she said, her tone entitled. I couldn't hold back. You never gave us a wedding gift, I countered. Not even a congratulations. Her response was cold. You're Richard's wife. You're supposed to honor me, not the other way around. Her audacity left me speechless. In all my years with Richard, I had never felt so disrespected. It was a wake-up call. I realized that I deserved better, that I couldn't spend the rest of my life in the shadows of someone else's family. That night, as I lay in bed, a plan began to form in my mind. It was time for a change. It was time for me to step out of the shadows and into the light. As the sun peeked through the blinds the next morning, I felt a new sense of determination. Over breakfast, Richard, oblivious to my inner turmoil, talked about his plans to help Eleanor move into her new apartment. I listened, nodding where appropriate, but my mind was elsewhere. Later that day at work, I couldn't shake off the feeling of discontent. My job, which had always been a source of pride and joy, now felt like the only aspect of my life where I had any control. I wondered how I had allowed myself to become so marginal in my own marriage. That evening, Richard didn't come home. It wasn't unusual anymore. I sat alone in the living room, the TV chattering in the background, providing a semblance of company. I realized that this emptiness had become my norm, a stark contrast to the lively, love-filled home I had once envisioned. Weeks passed in a similar pattern. Richard's visits home became more sporadic, and when he was home, his mind seemed elsewhere. Our conversations, once filled with shared dreams and laughter, were now reduced to logistical exchanges. One day, I returned home earlier than usual to find Richard waiting for me. He had a strange look in his eyes, a mix of guilt and something else I couldn't quite place. "Elizabeth, there's something I need to tell you," he began hesitantly. My heart raced, anticipating more bad news. Eleanor's divorce has taken a toll on her. She's struggling to cope, and I think we should help her more, he said. I felt a sense of déjà vu, another request to put his sister's needs above our own. "What do you mean by help her more?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Richard took a deep breath. "I think Eleanor and Sophie should move in with us for a while. Our house is bigger, and they need the support." I was speechless. The idea of Eleanor and Sophie, with their entitled attitudes, living in our home was unthinkable. Yet I knew arguing would be futile. Richard had made up his mind, and my opinion seemed irrelevant. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The thought of sharing my home with Eleanor and Sophie filled me with dread. It wasn't just about the invasion of my space, it was a symbol of how little my feelings mattered in this marriage. The following week, movers arrived with boxes of Eleanor and Sophie's belongings. I watched as my home transformed into a storage unit for their lives. Each box that entered felt like another piece of my sanctuary being taken away. As the movers left, I sat amidst the clutter, feeling more alone than ever. It was clear that Richard's family would always come first, and I was just a bystander in my own life. It was then that I realized I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed to make a change, for my own sanity and happiness. I had to find the courage to step out of the shadow of Richard's family and reclaim my life. As I pondered my next steps, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't continue living in a home that no longer felt like mine. I needed to find a place where I could be myself, free from the burden of being the unacknowledged partner in my own marriage. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in our house shifted dramatically. Eleanor and Sophie's presence was overwhelming, their personalities and habits encroaching on every aspect of my once peaceful home. Richard seemed more distant than ever, his attention fully consumed by his sister and niece. I started spending more time at work, often staying late to avoid returning to a house that no longer felt like mine. My colleagues noticed the change in my demeanor, but I brushed off their concerns with a smile and a shrug. Inside, I felt a growing sense of despair. One evening, as I finally mustered the courage to return home, I found Richard waiting for me, a stern look on his face. "Elizabeth, we need to talk," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. My heart sank. "What is it, Richard?" I asked, bracing myself for what was to come. "It's about Eleanor and Sophie," he began. "They're going through a tough time, and I think we need to do more to support them." I felt a flash of anger. "More?" I echoed incredulously. "Richard, they've already taken over our home. What more do you expect from me? He frowned, his patience wearing thin. I expect you to be a part of this family, Elizabeth. That means supporting each other, no matter what. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My role in this family had been reduced to a mere supporter, an afterthought in my own life. And what about us, Richard? What about our marriage? I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. He avoided my gaze. This is important to me, Elizabeth. You need to understand that. The conversation went in circles, with Richard refusing to acknowledge my feelings. It was clear that his loyalty lay with Eleanor and Sophie, and I was just an accessory in his life. That night, I lay awake in bed, a mix of emotions churning inside me. I felt betrayed, neglected, and utterly alone. It was a painful realization, but I knew that my marriage as I had known it was over. The next day, I made a decision. I would no longer be a bystander in my own life. I started searching for a new place to live, a haven where I could rebuild my life on my own terms. It wasn't easy. The thought of leaving the home I had built with Richard was daunting, but the prospect of staying in a loveless marriage was far worse. After several weeks of searching, I found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was modest, but it was mine. I signed the lease with a mixture of fear and excitement. I didn't tell Richard about my plans. I knew he wouldn't understand, and I no longer cared to seek his approval. I began packing my belongings in secret, each item a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. The day I moved out, Richard was at work. I left him a note, explaining that I needed space and time to think about our future. It was the most difficult thing I had ever done, but as I closed the door to our house for the last time, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The first few nights in my new apartment were filled with a mix of emotions. The quiet was both unsettling and liberating. I missed the familiarity of my old home, but I relished the freedom of my new space. This small apartment was a blank canvas, a place where I could start painting a new chapter in my life. As I unpacked my belongings, each item evoked a memory, a piece of the life I had shared with Richard. Some brought smiles, others tears. But with each box I emptied, I felt lighter, as if shedding the weight of years of unacknowledged feelings and unmet needs. The following week at work, my colleagues noticed the change in me. "You seem different, Elizabeth," one of them commented. "Lighter, somehow." I smiled, realizing that the decision to leave had not only changed my living situation, but had also started to change me. "I guess I am," I replied. Richard's reaction to my departure was a mix of confusion and frustration. He called several times, leaving messages that ranged from pleading to angry. I listened to each one, my resolve strengthening with his every word. One evening he showed up at my office, unannounced. "Elizabeth, we need to talk," he said, his face a picture of bewilderment and concern. I agreed to talk, but on my terms. We met at a nearby cafe, a neutral space where I felt more in control. "Why did you leave?" Richard asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I needed space, Richard," I replied calmly. "Space to think, to breathe, to be myself." He struggled to understand, his mind still entangled in the obligations to his sister and niece. "But we're a family," he insisted. "You can't just walk away from that." I shook my head. "A family should be a partnership, Richard. It's about mutual respect and understanding. I haven't felt that in a long time." Our conversation circled, with Richard trying to persuade me to return and me standing firm in my decision. It was clear that we were at an impasse, our paths diverging after years of walking side by side. After we parted ways, I walked back to my apartment, feeling a sense of peace. The conversation had confirmed that I had made the right decision. For the first time in years, I was choosing myself, my happiness. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, my new apartment began to feel like home. I decorated it with things that brought me joy, colors that lifted my spirits, and pictures that reflected my journey. I also started to explore new interests, joining a local book club and signing up for a pottery class. These activities brought new people into my life, people who knew me as Elizabeth, not as Richard's wife. I was rediscovering parts of myself that I had long forgotten or neglected. In this newfound freedom, I also found the courage to reflect on my marriage. I acknowledged the good times we had shared, but I also faced the painful truth of how unbalanced it had become. It was a bittersweet realization, but it was essential for my growth. As I lay in bed one night, listening to the soft hum of the city outside my window, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, grateful for the courage to make a change, grateful for the lessons learned, and most of all, grateful for the chance to rediscover myself. The autonomy of living on my own brought a clarity I hadn't realized I was missing. Each day, I grew more comfortable with my decision, feeling more like the protagonist in my life story, rather than a supporting character in someone else's. However, this new chapter was not without its challenges. A couple of months into my solo journey, I received a call that would once again shift the course of my life. It was from a private investigator I had discreetly hired after moving out, prompted by a nagging suspicion about Richard's increasingly odd behavior and absences. The investigator's findings were a harsh blow. Richard had been having an affair. The revelation was both shocking and oddly liberating. It explained so much of his recent behavior, the distance, the preoccupation. The pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I was assembling suddenly fell into place. Armed with this information, I confronted Richard. He was stunned, unprepared for my newfound assertiveness and the evidence I presented. His apologies and excuses fell on deaf ears. The betrayal was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I initiated the divorce proceedings, a process that was both painful and empowering. The legalities were complex, but I navigated them with a newfound resolve, fueled by the desire to close this chapter of my life. Richard's reaction to the divorce ranged from disbelief to anger, and finally, the revelation of his affair had consequences beyond our marriage. It affected his reputation, his relationships with friends and family, and most significantly, his relationship with Eleanor and Sophie. Eleanor and Sophie's reaction to the news was a mixture of shock and denial. They had placed Richard on a pedestal, and the revelation that he was capable of such deception shattered their image of him. As the divorce finalized, I found myself on the other side of a journey I never expected to take. I was now a single woman, with a past that was a mix of fond memories and painful lessons. But more importantly, I was a woman who had found her voice, her strength, and her independence. The settlement from the divorce, including alimony, was fair but hardly a windfall. It was not about the money, it was about the acknowledgement of my worth and the years I had invested in a marriage that ultimately failed me. Post-divorce, Richard's life took a downturn. His affair had not only cost him his marriage, but also his reputation. The ripple effects were evident in his professional life, and soon he left his job. For me, life after divorce was about rediscovery. I continued exploring new hobbies and interests, building a network of friends who valued me for who I was, not for my marital status or who I was married to. The freedom of this new life was exhilarating. I traveled, I read, I created. I lived on my terms, with no apologies or excuses. The world, once so narrow and confined, now seemed vast and full of possibilities. As I settled into my new normal, I realized that the end of my marriage was not just an ending, but also a beginning of a life where I was the author, where each day was a blank page waiting to be filled with my story, written in my words. Life has a way of testing you, offering lessons wrapped in unexpected envelopes. Just when I thought I had severed all ties with my past, it came knocking on my door in the form of Eleanor and Sophie. I received a message from Sophie, now a young adult, her tone desperate. "Aunt Elizabeth, we need your help. Things have been really tough since you left." I paused upon reading it, a whirlwind of emotions overtaking me. Part of me felt obliged to respond, to offer some assistance, but another part, the part that had fought so hard to establish boundaries and to gain self-respect, resisted. It took some time and self-reflection, but I decided not to reply to Sophie's message. This was their battle to fight, not mine. I had already spent too many years sacrificing my own well-being for the sake of Richard and his family. Eleanor also reached out, her voice laced with the same haughty tone that had always made me bristle. "Elizabeth, we're in a real bind here. I never thought I'd have to ask, but we need financial help." I could hardly believe it. After everything that had transpired, Eleanor still expected me to come to their rescue. It was a stark reminder of the dynamic that had existed in our relationships for all those years. My decision stood firm. "Eleanor, I wish you and Sophie well, but I cannot help you. I said as calmly as I could. There was silence on the line, followed by a string of accusations and insults, reminiscent of so many past conversations. I ended the call and blocked their numbers, severing the last threads of a bond that had brought me little but pain and diminishment. My heart raced with a mixture of guilt and empowerment, signaling the end of an era. At that moment, I knew I had truly turned a page. I felt a complete detachment from the life I once knew, a life where I was unseen and unheard. That night, as I lay in bed, I considered the full weight of the step I had taken. There was a profound sense of finality in my refusal, a clear line drawn between my past and my present. In the silence of my apartment, I pondered the journey that had led me to this point. There was a haunting loneliness in recognizing that I was now entirely on my own, that the family I had once been part of, for better or worse, was now nothing but a part of my history. Yet, with the loneliness came a powerful realization of my strength and independence. I no longer needed the approval or validation of others to feel worthy. I was my own person, standing on my own ground, guided by my own principles and desires. The next morning I awoke with a newfound sense of peace. I had faced my past head-on, and in doing so, I had found a deeper sense of self. It was a freedom born not just from my new life, but from the recognition of my inner resilience and the courage to uphold my boundaries. The dawn of each new day greeted me with a promise, a whisper of the untold possibilities that lay ahead. My journey, marked by turmoil and triumph, had led me to embrace solitude, not as a burden but as a companion. With each sunrise I grew more attuned to the rhythms of my own heart, my life now a melody composed of my choices and desires. In the solitude of my new chapter, I sought a friend, a non-judgmental companion to share the quiet moments that bookended my days of self-discovery. The idea of adopting a dog began as a whisper in my mind, a gentle nudge that grew louder with time. One brisk Saturday morning, I walked into the local animal shelter, a sense of mission guiding my steps. The cacophony of barks and whimpers could have been overwhelming, but instead, it felt like a chorus of hope of second chances. My gaze met a pair of soulful brown eyes belonging to a middle-aged beagle mix with an earnest expression. He wagged his tail tentatively, as if unsure of his place in the world, much like I had been. It was a connection that needed no words. I knew he was the one. I named him Max, and together we embarked on the next leg of our journey, both of us seeking love and acceptance in a new beginning. In the company of Max, my home, once a silent space, filled with the soft patter of paws and the comforting presence of another beating heart. Our walks became a meditative ritual, a time to reflect on the path traveled and to revel in the simple joy of being alive, of being free. Looking back, the road I had traveled seemed intricately woven with pain and purpose. I often pondered on the lessons learned, the tears shed, and the laughter echoed in the corridors of time. Above all, I had learned the paramount importance of self-care and independence, the foundations upon which my new life was built. Freedom had been a costly pursuit, both emotionally and financially, but its rewards were immeasurable. I no longer saw myself through the lens of others, but rather through my own understanding of who I was and who I wanted to be. Some nights, Max and I would sit by the window, watching the stars twinkle in the vast canvas of the sky. In those moments of quiet companionship, I realized that while the future was unwritten, I approached it not with trepidation, but with curiosity and a sense of adventure. I had indeed come a long way, from the unacknowledged partner to a woman of resilience and substance. My journey bore witness to the metamorphosis of a soul from the shackles of neglect to the wings of autonomy. As I pen down these final words, the chapter of my rebirth draws to a close. Yet, the story of Elizabeth Martin is far from over. With Max by my side and a heart open to life's infinite tapestry, I step forward, a weaver of my own destiny. I remember the day I moved in with Michael and his parents. It was a sunny morning in June, the kind that held promises of new beginnings. Michael and I had been dating for a year, and everything about our relationship felt right. We were young, in love, and ready to start a new chapter together. The move was significant for me. Leaving my small hometown and moving 5 hours away to live with Michael was a leap of faith. My parents were supportive but cautious, reminding me to always keep my independence in mind. Michael had asked for their blessing, which they gave after many heart-to-heart conversations. His parents' house was a cozy two-story building with a welcoming porch and a well-tended garden. The first time I visited, I was struck by its warmth. Michael's parents, Linda and Robert, greeted me with open arms. Linda was a petite woman with a smile that lit up the room, and Robert was a tall, jovial man who could make anyone laugh within minutes of meeting him. I felt a connection with them instantly. During those early visits, Linda and I would spend hours chatting in the kitchen, baking cookies, or preparing dinner. She had a way of making everything seem effortless, and I admired her for that. Robert was equally engaging, always ready with a story or a joke, making sure everyone around him was having a good time. Moving in felt like the natural next step. Michael and I talked about it for months, and when the day finally came, it was exciting. My stuff fit into the room Michael and I shared, and his parents made sure I felt welcome. Linda hugged me tightly, saying, "Welcome to the family, dear." The first few weeks were like living in a dream. I was getting along great with Michael's parents. We had family dinners every night, where we shared stories and laughed over Robert's jokes. Linda would sometimes whisper advice about handling Michael's quirks, and I found her insights invaluable. I noticed how they all worked as a unit, and I did my best to fit into their rhythm. I helped with chores, trying not to step on anyone's toes. Michael seemed happy, and seeing him in his element, surrounded by his family, made me love him even more. However, as weeks turned into months, the initial excitement started to wane. I began noticing little things, subtle shifts in behavior that I hadn't picked up on before. It was nothing major at first, just a sense of something being slightly off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt a change in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. I shrugged it off initially, attributing it to the adjustment phase of living together. But as more time passed, these small changes began to form a pattern, one that I couldn't ignore for long. It was the beginning of what would become a challenging journey, one that would test my strength, my relationship, and my understanding of what it means to be part of a family. As autumn set in, the warmth of the summer months seemed to fade, not just outside, but within the walls of the house as well. The subtle changes I had noticed earlier were becoming more pronounced, more frequent. It was as if a different side of Linda and Robert was slowly revealing itself, one I hadn't seen before. One evening, I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner. It was something I had done many times before, but this time something was different. I had stepped away for a moment, leaving a couple of my dishes in the sink. When I returned, I found that Linda had washed everything else but had left my dishes untouched, set aside as if they were somehow separate, unclean. At first, I thought it might have been an oversight, but it happened again, and then again. It wasn't just the dishes. It was little things, like Linda moving my belongings to a corner of the room, or Robert making offhand comments about my job or my habits. It was never anything overtly hostile, but it stung all the same. I tried to talk to Michael about it to see if he had noticed anything. His response was always the same, a shrug and a quick, "That's just how they are, they don't mean anything by it." But I wasn't convinced. It felt personal, intentional. One incident in particular left a deep mark. It was a simple, casual cruelty, the kind that slices through you because it comes when your guard is down. I was serving Michael his dinner when Linda, with a pointed look, asked, "You're eating again?" Her tone was light, almost joking, but the implication was clear. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and shame. I had always been self-conscious about my weight, a fact that Linda knew. Her comment hit me hard, and from that day on I started skipping meals, eating only when I was sure I was alone. The joy I once found in cooking and sharing meals with the family vanished, replaced by anxiety and a deepening sense of isolation. Michael didn't notice, or if he did, he never said anything. It felt as though I was becoming invisible in my own home, my presence tolerated rather than welcomed. The relationship I had thought so fondly of with Linda and Robert was crumbling, and I couldn't understand why. I started spending more time in our room, away from the family. The house, once a symbol of a new chapter in my life with Michael, now felt like a trap, confining and cold. I felt alone, misunderstood, and increasingly unwanted. I clung to the belief that this was just a phase, that things would get better with time. But deep down, I knew that something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer just Michael's girlfriend. I was an outsider, living under the same roof but feeling miles apart. The growing tension in the house was like a silent storm, brewing beneath the surface, waiting to break. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, that storm would soon find its voice in ways I could never have anticipated. Winter arrived with its short days and long, cold nights, mirroring the growing chill inside the house. The unease I felt around Linda was now compounded by a new, more unsettling problem: Robert's behavior. Robert, once the jovial storyteller, began showing a side of himself that was far less amiable, especially after he'd had a few drinks. His humor, which I once found endearing, turned biting and cruel. He'd make offhand remarks about people's appearances, often focusing on their weight, and laugh it off as though it were all in good fun. But the laughter never reached his eyes. One evening, his comments became personal. He made a joke about my weight in front of Michael and his friends. I excused myself quickly, holding back tears until I was safely in the bathroom. Michael came to check on me later, brushing off his father's words as just Dad being Dad. But it was more than that. It was humiliation, served coldly and publicly. The incident that truly shook me happened when Michael was out of town for work. I was taking a shower, lost in thought, when I heard the bathroom door handle jiggle. I had locked the door, a habit I had formed since moving in. Through the frosted glass, I saw Robert's silhouette. He knocked, his voice slurred, asking if I needed help. I replied sharply that I was fine, but my heart was racing. The thought of what might have happened if I hadn't locked the door sent shivers down my spine. I confronted Michael about it when he returned, but he seemed unable to grasp the severity of the situation. He assured me it was a misunderstanding, that his dad probably just didn't realize I was in the shower. But I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, the sense that I wasn't safe in my own home. Amidst all this, I continued to help Linda and Robert with their needs. I assisted Linda with her medical paperwork, drove her to appointments 2 hours away, and even missed classes to be there for her. For Robert, I helped with their immigration papers, communicating with lawyers and organizing documents. I poured myself into these tasks, hoping to bridge the growing gap between us. But my efforts seemed to go unnoticed, or worse, unappreciated. The more I did, the more I felt like I was being used, a means to an end rather than a valued member of the family. It was a stark contrast to the early days of baking cookies and sharing laughs. Now every smile felt forced, every conversation strained. I confided in Michael about how I felt, but his reactions only added to my distress. He accused me of being ungrateful, of not understanding the sacrifices his parents had made for him. He called me a spoiled brat for complaining about people who had done so much for him. I felt increasingly isolated, not just from his parents, but from Michael as well. The man I moved 5 hours to be with, the man I loved, seemed to be on a completely different page. I began to question everything about our relationship, about the decision to move in with his family, about who I was in this dynamic. I was stuck in a home that no longer felt like home, with people who saw me as an outsider and a partner who didn't seem to see me at all. The feeling of going crazy, of not being able to trust my own feelings, was overwhelming. I was lost, struggling to find my footing in a place where I once thought I'd stand firm. The tension in the house had reached a palpable level, like a thick fog that refused to lift. I knew I couldn't continue living this way, walking on eggshells, feeling unwelcome in my own home. It was time for a direct conversation with Michael, one where I laid out everything that had been weighing on me. I chose a quiet evening, when Michael and I were alone in our room, to broach the subject. My heart pounded as I started to speak, my words laced with a mix of frustration and desperation. I told him about the growing distance with his parents, the hurtful comments, the incidents that made me feel unsafe, and how his reactions only added to my feelings of isolation. Michael listened, but his expression grew increasingly defensive. When I finished, he let out a long sigh and shook his head. "Anna, you're overthinking things. My parents are good people. They've been through a lot. You just need to try harder to understand them. His words felt like a slap. Try harder? I had been bending over backward to fit into his family, to be helpful, understanding, and patient. But it was never enough. And now, instead of support, I was met with accusations of overreacting. The argument that followed was heated and painful. Michael accused me of being ungrateful, of not appreciating the roof over my head and the efforts his parents had made to welcome me. He said I was acting like a spoiled brat, creating problems where there were none. I tried to explain how his words hurt me, how they made me feel alone and unsupported. But the more I spoke, the more he seemed to withdraw, his words turning colder, more dismissive. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling a chasm growing between Michael and me. The man I loved, the man I had moved cities for, was telling me that my feelings, my experiences, were invalid. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, questioning my own perceptions and judgments. The following days were a blur of tension and awkward silences. Michael and I were like strangers, passing each other in the house without a word. His parents seemed oblivious to the storm brewing, or perhaps they chose to ignore it. I began to wonder if I was indeed the problem. Was I being too sensitive? Was I expecting too much? These questions haunted me, eroding my confidence and sense of self. I felt trapped, not just in the house, but in my own mind, doubting everything I thought I knew. But amidst the turmoil, a small voice inside me whispered that this wasn't right. I couldn't be the only one at fault here. The treatment I received, the lack of support from Michael, the feeling of being an outsider in my own home, these were not figments of my imagination. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. I needed to find a way out of this cycle of doubt and unhappiness. I needed to reclaim my sense of self, to find my voice again. But the path to doing so was murky and fraught with uncertainty. I was standing at a crossroads with each direction leading into the unknown. As winter gave way to the early signs of spring, the internal storm I was weathering showed no signs of subsiding. The house felt colder than ever, a stark contrast to the blooming world outside. Inside, I was battling a turmoil that seemed to grow with each passing day. I spent long hours in our room, alone with my thoughts, reflecting on everything that had happened. My relationship with Michael, once the source of so much joy and hope, now felt like a maze of confusion and pain. I loved him, but that love was entangled in a web of resentment, misunderstanding, and deep emotional disconnect. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I had changed since moving in with Michael and his parents. I had always prided myself on being strong, independent, and confident. But now I found myself questioning my every move, doubting my every thought. The vibrant, self-assured woman I once was seemed like a distant memory. I also reflected on the sacrifices I had made. Moving 5 hours away from my family had been a significant step, one I had taken out of love and trust. But now I felt isolated, not just from my family but from the person I used to be. My world had shrunk to the confines of this house, and with it my sense of self. My conversations with Michael had become sparse and functional. The warmth we once shared replaced by a cautious politeness. It was as if we were both treading on thin ice, afraid that any wrong step could shatter the fragile surface under our feet. In moments of solitude, I found myself yearning for the comfort of my family. I missed the easy laughter, the unconditional support, the feeling of being understood and accepted for who I was. I missed being able to share my thoughts without fear of judgment or dismissal. The realization hit me hard. I was losing myself in this relationship, in this house. The Anna that moved in months ago was not the Anna I saw in the mirror now. I had become a shadow, a version of myself that was unfamiliar and unsettling. The question of what to do next weighed heavily on my mind. Leaving seemed like the obvious solution, but it wasn't that simple. There were financial considerations, the fear of being alone, and the daunting prospect of starting over. But staying meant continuing to live in an environment that was slowly eroding my sense of self-worth and happiness. I sought counsel from friends and even considered therapy. Each conversation brought new perspectives, but the decision ultimately was mine to make. It was clear that something had to change. I couldn't continue living in a state of perpetual unhappiness and self-doubt. As spring turned into summer, the decision crystallized in my mind. I needed to find my independence again, to reclaim the life I had before, a life where I felt strong, valued, and happy. The journey ahead would be challenging, but the first step, as always, is the hardest. As the summer sun brought warmth and light, I knew it was time to make some decisions. The resolve to change my situation had been growing, and now it was time to act. I started by seeking advice and support outside the walls of the house that had become my prison. Talking to friends was a balm for my weary soul. They listened, offered empathy, and reminded me of the person I used to be. Their words were like a mirror, reflecting a version of myself I had almost forgotten. It was during these conversations that I realized the importance of having a support system, people who saw me for who I truly was. I also sought professional help. The therapist I met with provided a safe space to unravel my thoughts and feelings. It was through these sessions that I began to understand the depth of the impact my living situation had on me. I was not crazy or overly sensitive. I was reacting to a genuinely challenging environment. Armed with this newfound clarity, I started exploring my options. I began saving money, cutting down on unnecessary expenses, and looking for affordable places I could move into. The idea of living on my own was daunting, but it also filled me with a sense of excitement and freedom. It was a tangible goal, a light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. The most challenging part was confronting Michael about our relationship. I chose a quiet evening when we were both calm and rested to have the conversation. I explained my feelings, my need for independence, and how our current living situation was affecting me. I told him that I was considering moving out, not to end our relationship, but to save it. Michael's reaction was mixed. He seemed to understand on some level why I felt the way I did. But there was also a sense of hurt, a feeling of being abandoned. We talked for hours, navigating our way through a maze of emotions and fears. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in months. Despite the pain and the uncertainty, there was a sense of relief in having everything out in the open. We agreed to give each other some space to think about what we both wanted from the relationship and our lives. The weeks that followed were a time of introspection and planning. I continued to save money, research apartments, and mentally prepare myself for the possibility of a new beginning. The decision to move out was not an easy one, but it felt right. It was a step towards reclaiming my independence, my sense of self. Through it all, I held on to the hope that Michael and I could find a way to navigate this new phase of our relationship. But I also knew that no matter what happened between us, I needed to be true to myself, to live a life where I felt respected, valued, and happy. The decision to move out was like turning the page to a new chapter in my life. It was a step filled with uncertainty, but also with a sense of empowerment. I had finally taken control of my situation, making a choice that prioritized my well-being. As I started packing my things, I felt a mix of emotions. There was sadness in leaving a place I had once hoped would be a long-term home, and in the strain it had placed on my relationship with Michael. But there was also a growing sense of excitement and liberation. I was about to embark on a journey of self-discovery, to rebuild the life I wanted on my own terms. The day I moved out, Michael helped me with my bags. Our goodbye was bittersweet. We promised to keep in touch, to try and work on our relationship from a new perspective. But there was also an unspoken understanding that things might never be the same again. That was a reality we both had to accept. Moving into my new apartment, a small but cozy space, was a breath of fresh air. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The walls of my new home were blank canvases, waiting for me to fill them with my own story, my own identity. In the weeks that followed, I focused on myself. I reconnected with hobbies and interests I had neglected, spent more time with friends and family, and continued my therapy sessions. Each day was a step towards healing, towards rebuilding the confidence and self-assuredness I had lost. My relationship with Michael evolved in unexpected ways. With the distance between us, we began to see each other and our relationship more clearly. We had deep, meaningful conversations about our needs and expectations. Sometimes they were difficult and emotional, but they were always honest. In this newfound space, I rediscovered parts of myself that I had lost. I rekindled my love for painting, a passion I had set aside in the chaos of the past months. I started a small freelance project, combining my artistic skills with a newfound sense of entrepreneurial spirit. It was a small step, but it filled me with a sense of purpose and joy. As summer turned to autumn, I looked back at the journey I had been on. It was a path marked by challenges, self-doubt, and pain, but also by growth, resilience, and self-discovery. I had learned the hard way that sometimes, to find your place in the world, you have to be willing to leave the comfort of what you know. My story with Michael was still being written. Whether we would find our way back to each other or forge separate paths, only time would tell. But one thing was clear. I was no longer the person who had moved into his parents' house all those months ago. I was stronger, wiser, and more in tune with who I was and what I wanted from life. And for the first time in a long time, I was genuinely excited about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead. I had found my path forward, and I was ready to see where it would lead.
Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
When I discovered that my wife of 6 years had cheated on me twice and was planning to do it again, I was completely devastated. I had heard about the overwhelming emotions that hit when someone realizes their marriage is a lie, but nothing prepared me for it. My marriage, the life I thought I had, turned out to be a sham. The emotions flooded in, hitting me like Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. My internal levee broke, and the waves of pain and betrayal engulfed everything I had been with her. I cried hard. When the flood of tears finally stopped, there was nothing left. Nothing I could recognize, nothing I could salvage. The trust? Gone. The respect? Gone. Admiration, caring, sexual attraction? All gone. The love I thought we shared had been wiped out. It was like looking at pictures of the aftermath of a hurricane. No solid ground to rebuild on, just devastation so overwhelming that you want to walk away. And that's exactly what I was going to do with my marriage. Give up and walk away. She had torn it apart, spun it until there was nothing left but unrecognizable debris. It was over. Kathy and I had a fight that day. Nothing out of the ordinary at first, but it turned ugly fast. She had been pushing me to refurnish our living room, saying the furniture was old and she was tired of it. I told her the furniture wasn't old. It was barely 2 years old and had cost a lot of money. I wasn't about to spend that kind of cash again so soon. She kept pushing, saying she was sick of it and wanted something new. I made the mistake of escalating the argument by saying, "I suppose you're sick of me too, huh? Want to go screw someone else because you're tired of me? Why can't you just be happy with what you have?" And then she fired back, "Well, maybe I should go screw someone else. Maybe then you'd realize what you have and what you could lose." Of course, I didn't let that one go either and yelled, "Well, you decide what you want out of life, Kathy, and just go for it. But don't expect me to be here waiting for you when you come back." Then she drove a spike in me when she said, "I guess I should have married Roger instead of you. Maybe he wouldn't have been such a cheap bum like you are." That did it. I literally screamed at her, "Screw you and screw him too. I don't ever want to hear his name brought up again. And you are not getting new furniture, no matter what you do or say." End of discussion. I stormed out of the house and drove to the club for a few beers. I was furious and I needed time to cool off before I talked to her again. Roger was my all-time arch-rival. He was the golden boy of our community. Everything he touched went his way with one exception. He touched my wife years ago, but she was in love with me and married me and not him. They dated a few times during a short period when she and I had broken up. He had his sights set on her and almost succeeded, but not quite. She did marry me. I worked my butt off in my job and made a very respectable living. In fact, more than respectable. Roger looked at a project, and it started making him money. I was in business for years, and my reputation grew steadily because of hard work and honesty. Everyone just assumed that Roger was reputable and trustworthy. He never had to prove himself. Was I jealous? No, I wasn't jealous of his business position. I was raised to work hard and be honest and reliable, and I would never be jealous of someone's success. But I was a bit sensitive of him when it came to Kathy. I would always remember that she had gone out with him, that he had touched her. It was about 2 hours later, right around 9 p.m., and my cell phone rang. I looked at the number, and it was my home phone number. I decided to let it go to my voicemail rather than talk to her at the moment because I was still pretty steamed, and on top of that I had a few under my belt, and figured I might just say something I would regret later. A short time later I retrieved my voicemail and listened to her message. "Ben, I called to tell you I was sorry for the things I said to you earlier. I guess you don't care enough to take my call though because you had to see it was me calling. Since you aren't coming home, I guess I will just go out for a while myself. See you later." That really cut it. I had started to come around after our argument, But now I was angry all over again. I got myself another beer and downed it in a couple of minutes, and then went looking for her. I cruised through every bar parking lot in town and didn't see her car. I finally thought that maybe she had gone out with someone else, so I drove over to her best friend Nancy's house, and sure enough, there was her car parked in front of Nancy's house. I walked up to the front door and knocked. In about a minute, Nathan, Nancy's husband, came to the door and asked me, "How are things with you, Ben? I hear you and Kathy had a little argument tonight." "They are not here. They decided to do a bit of bar hopping tonight at the last minute." "Well, Nathan, I didn't see Kathy's car at the bars, so I figured maybe she was here with Nancy. Can you tell me what car Nancy is driving so I can go look for them? She has the expedition tonight. I think they were going to start out at Bachelor's and work their way back toward here," he added. I left and drove straight to Bachelor's, and sure enough, Nancy's excursion was in the parking lot. I thought about going right in and confronting Kathy, but I was still a bit buzzed from all the beer and thought it might be better if I just sat in the car for a while and sobered up before we had it out again. A few minutes after 11 p.m. they came out and got in Nancy's car and left the parking lot. I followed at a safe distance, and as Nathan had said, they drove to the down the hill bar and went in. I again sat in the parking lot for a while, just keeping an eye on things. I figured that it wouldn't be too long before they headed for the next place, and I wasn't wrong. At exactly 11:30 p.m., they drove to what I figured would be the next and last stop of the night, Fuzzy's Pub at the Ramada Plaza Hotel. Midnight rolled around and Nancy came out of the hotel and got into her car and drove away. What is this? I asked myself. Just how foolish was Kathy going to be here? Was she going to do something stupid? I knew I had to find out. I got a baseball cap and my team shirt out of the trunk and put them on as some form of a disguise. Now I wasn't totally sobered up yet, so my disguise was less than perfect. You see, my name was on the shirt. I didn't figure anyone would pay that close of attention to it though, so I knew it was better than no disguise at all. Minutes later, I worked my way into Fuzzy's and found an out-of-the-way spot where I could observe things. That is when I saw Kathy with Roger. That a-hole. She was with Roger. They were at a booth against the back wall of the bar, about as far out of the way as you could get. I noticed that there was an empty booth right behind Kathy, so I moved toward it with as much caution as I could muster. I needn't have worried. The two of them were so engrossed in conversation that they wouldn't have noticed a water buffalo getting into that booth. From where I was seated, I could hear their entire conversation, except the couple of times when he must have leaned forward to kiss her and whispered to her. "Thanks for coming, Roger. I didn't want to have to keep Nancy out all night," she said. "No problem," Roger said. "You know I love it when you and Ben have a fight. That is the only time you let me have a piece of you. 7 years ago, you two split up and I got to screw you for a while, and twice more since you have been married. I am perfectly happy to give you another revenge sex tonight too. I wish you two would fight more often than you do." "Well," she said, "you know I love him to death, but when he pisses me off like tonight, I can't help myself. I need a revenge sex just so he doesn't win." As I listened to this conversation, the realization that she had cheated on me 2 times in the past 6 years of our marriage and was planning on doing it again tonight drove me to the condition I was in when I started telling you this story. She could say anything she wanted to say about loving me to death, but her actions proved otherwise. She screwed Roger to get even with me, to keep me from winning, as she put it. That is not love. That is a selfish, uncaring woman, and it caused all the changes I mentioned. Right or wrong, it destroyed me and my love. Don't tell me I am stupid because I won't listen. It is what it is, and I knew I didn't love her anymore. Oh, I cried over the loss, but it was over. I waited for a while, wondering how long it would be before they headed for a room. It wasn't long before I heard him say, "Well, Kathy, you ready for my big Johnny?" I could almost see the grin on her face. I knew it would be there because I had heard the words. She spoke to him. "I am all ready for you," she said. Then she laughed. "I might even take it home and let Ben have sloppy seconds with me tonight. He will be so drunk that he won't even know the difference." Roger roared with that one. Man, I would like nothing better than to send a cream pie home to dear sweet Ben. Lucky for them, they got up and headed for the elevators. I was ready to kill. Maybe it was lucky for me because I think I actually may have done some serious damage to them. A short time later, I followed them into the lobby. I couldn't tell what floor they had stopped on, so I went to the house phone and asked for Roger Brown's room. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up, and I said with a slurred voice, "Is this room 112? He replied, "No, this isn't 112. What the hell are you doing calling this room at this hour?" And he hung up. I asked them to call his room for me again, and when he picked up, I said, "Well, I thought this was 112, say. You were trying to fool me, and it is 112, isn't it? You dumb drunken a-hole. This isn't room 113, it's 214, and if you call here again, I am going to have the manager call the police." He slammed the phone down. Now who is calling me a hole anyway? Seems to me the dumb scumsucker is the guy who just gave a furious and dangerous husband the room number where his is going to screw the wife. I rode the elevator to the 4th floor and walked down the hall to room 214. I listened at the door until I heard them in the heat of it, and then I pounded on the door. I heard him yell, "Now what the hell?" And I actually got a big kick out of that because I knew I would soon destroy his sex party. I stood back from the peephole so he couldn't see me, and when he opened the door a crack I slammed it in so hard that the security chain burst off the door jamb and the door flew open. There on the bed was my beautiful cheating wife, naked as the day she was born. When I burst through the door she screamed and her face turned totally white. I am surprised she didn't pass out. Oh God, no. Oh God, no. Roger finally got over the shock of me breaking through the door and yelled at me, "Ben, get your butt out of my room. I am going to call security. Remember what I said about dumb idiot?" Well, I hit the dumb idiot with one well-placed punch to his solar plexus and down he went. There were several minutes when he did not move at all. I would have no more trouble with him. "Kathy, you lying cheating 304. I know everything. I heard all of the crap you told him, and now I know it all. Don't bother to come home tonight. It would be a big mistake." "Oh God, no, Ben. Let me come home. I can explain. This means nothing to me. I love you." "Oh God, no. You heard me, you 304. Don't make the second biggest mistake of your life and come home. It will not turn out well for you. And yes, you can take that as a threat." I turned and walked out the door. I was actually surprised that I could be as calm as I was. I had wanted to kill them both minutes earlier, and taking only one punch at the dumb idiot showed unbelievable control on my part. I know I was pretty abusive in my language to her, but it could have been much worse. When I got in my car I got in, and just sat there for a while trying to calm myself even more. I also figured I would wait around for a few minutes, just to see if the police would show up, or if Kathy would leave with Roger. After about 15 minutes Roger came out of the hotel, and got in a vehicle and left. A few minutes after he left Nancy showed up again and Kathy came out and got into the excursion. I was at least glad that the two of them hadn't stayed in the hotel room to screw after I left. It isn't as if the damage had not already been done, but that would have added insult upon injury or fuel to the fire as they say. That gave me an idea. I drove home and went to bed. I don't even know what time it was that the phone rang and caller ID showed it was Nancy. "Ben, I know you are upset with Kathy and don't want her to come home, but I wanted to call you and tell you that she is staying with Nathan and I so you wouldn't worry about her." "Nancy, I wasn't going to worry about her anymore. I don't care about her anymore. You needn't have woken me up. What time is it anyway?" "It's 3 a.m., Ben, and you can't tell me you don't care. I know you love Kathy, and she loves you. She is here, and she is crying her eyes out over how stupid she was tonight, and she wants you to forgive her and let her come home." "Nancy, she can't come home. Ask her if her stupidity goes back to the other 2 times she screwed Roger before tonight." "Oh God, no," Nancy said as I hung up the phone. I guess she didn't know about the other times Kathy had screwed that a-hole. I am fortunate in that I am not one to get huge hangovers, and besides I had quit drinking quite early in the evening, so even though I was very tired I was up and about by 8 a.m. By 10 a.m., I was ready for my confrontation with Kathy. I called Nancy's house and told her that Kathy could come home if she wanted to. I was standing out on the driveway when she pulled in a few minutes later. Nathan and Nancy had followed her home. I am sure they were there to make sure I didn't hurt her in any way. When Kathy got out of her car her eyes were quite wide as she asked me, "Ben, what is all of that in the front yard?" "Kathy, that is everything I could think of in this house that would remind you of me. Everything you have ever given to me. Everything I have ever given to you. It is all of the pictures of our courtship and our 6 years of married life. I cannot think of one thing left in the house that will remind you of me. I even put the old furniture out here so you could go out and buy new like you wanted. And the last thing is this," and I held up our wedding picture. I walked over to the end table that used to sit alongside my chair, also on the pile, and set the picture on it. I walked the few paces back to the driveway and dropped a lighted match into the trail of gasoline I had poured out to the driveway. It lit, and the flames quickly retraced my steps back to the pile of memories of me. It wasn't long before the whole pile was engulfed in flames. That was one hell of a bonfire. There was little left except for ashes and burned-out furniture framing. I looked over at Kathy, who was obviously in shock, and said, "You and Kathy, I heard you tell Roger that you didn't ever want me to win. I hope it was all worth it. Our marriage is over. You can have everything else. I want nothing from this marriage. I only hope that I won't remember you either. You will be hearing from my attorney." Minutes later, as I heard the sound of sirens approaching from down the street, and a police squad car drove up and 2 officers came over to ask what had happened. It was a couple of minutes later that the fire department arrived to put out what was left of the smoldering mass. The gasoline had done its work, and the pile had been reduced to charred rubble in minutes. This is just me destroying the remnants of a marriage in ruins, officers. I am sorry for the trouble I have caused. Needless to say, they took me into custody. As I was ushered into the squad car, I glanced at Kathy and could see her sobbing. I spent a couple of days in jail, and they had a psychiatrist evaluate my sanity. Surprisingly, they discovered that I was sane. Saddened and destroyed, but sane. I think they would have let me out sooner, but they wanted to observe me for a couple of days, just to be certain. I did make bail, and went to pick up my car from my office parking lot. All of the items I had wanted to keep were in the car. It was mainly my clothing and a few other personal items. I drove to the closest motel and got myself a room for a few days until I could locate an apartment to rent. A few weeks later, I was completely settled in and had started to move on with my life. My court case came up and I went and pled guilty to all charges and was fined $5,000 in court costs. That was a small price to pay to wipe out my ruined marriage. Kathy contested the divorce and kept leaving me voice messages on my cell phone. She was begging me to talk to her, to forgive her because it meant nothing to her, to take her back. I left one message on our home phone when I knew she would be at work. I said, "Kathy, you tell me it meant nothing to you, but it meant everything to me. Do you understand? It meant everything to me. Goodbye." I never heard from her again. The divorce did go through, and I gave her everything she wanted. I just wanted to be done with her. Roger's wife got wind of the whole thing and divorced him, and really took him to the cleaners. Apparently, Kathy wasn't the only wife that Roger consoled when they fought with their husbands. A couple of weeks after I barged into his hotel room and caught him with my wife, I ran into Roger at Fuzzy's. I think I must have surprised him because he didn't have time to get up and escape. I leaned on his shoulder as he sat on a bar stool, and I told him that I was pretty sure if he hung around town, he was bound to have some kind of serious accident someday. When his divorce was final, he started liquidating what was left of his holdings, and before too long his absence from town was obvious. Strangely, not too many people really missed him all that much. Well, I actually had hoped he would stick around town. I run into Kathy around town once in a while, and every time she tells me how sorry she is and asks if I will call her to talk, I just nod and walk away, and to this day I have not called her, but she keeps asking. Who knows, maybe someday I will call her. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
The clinking of silverware against plates echoed through the dining room as our family gathered for another routine Sunday dinner. My husband, Caleb, chatted amiably with my niece, Lila, who had been staying with us for the weekend. The aroma of my famous pot roast filled the air, but little did I know that the evening's events would leave a far more pungent taste. "This is delicious, Aunt Meredith," Lila said, taking another bite. "It's been so long since I've had a home-cooked meal like this." "Thank you, sweetie," I replied with a smile, savoring the moment of normalcy amidst the chaos that was about to unfold. Caleb nodded in agreement, his mouth full. "Your aunt's a fantastic cook. You should come over more often." Lila's gaze dropped, her expression turning somber. "I'm not sure if that's such a good idea." An uneasy silence settled over the table. Caleb and I exchanged a puzzled glance, sensing the shift in Lila's demeanor. "What's wrong, honey?" I asked, reaching across the table to touch her hand. Lila's eyes welled up with tears, and she let out a shuddering breath. "I can't keep this a secret anymore. Dad, he's been doing something illegal at work." The words hung heavy in the air, like a suffocating fog. Caleb's brow furrowed, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. "What do you mean, illegal?" He probed gently. Lila's trembling hands gripped the table's edge. "He's been embezzling money from the company. I overheard him talking about it on the phone with someone." My heart sank, and a wave of nausea washed over me. My own brother Derek, stealing from the very company that employed us both? It seemed too outrageous to be true, and yet Lila's distress left little room for doubt. "Are you sure about this, Lila?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "I wouldn't lie about something like this, Aunt Meredith. He's been acting strange for months, always stressed and spending money like it's going out of style. I didn't want to believe it at first, but the evidence is staring us right in the face." Caleb reached across the table, clasping Lila's hand in a reassuring gesture. "We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise. Your dad's going to have to answer for his actions, but we'll make sure you and your mom are taken care of." As the gravity of the situation sank in, I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. Derek was my own flesh and blood, someone I had trusted implicitly. Now, his actions threatened to tear our family apart, and I found myself caught in the crosshairs of a battle I never saw coming. The pot roast lay untouched, its once tantalizing aroma now a bitter reminder of the harsh reality that had invaded our home. As Layla's confession echoed in my mind, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I could barely sleep that night, Lila's revelation replaying in my mind like a broken record. How could Derek, my own brother, be capable of such deceit? As morning light crept through the curtains, I resolved to confront him and get to the bottom of this mess. Caleb insisted on coming with me, his jaw set in a grim line. He's not going to like what we have to say, but he needs to face the consequences of his actions. We arrived at Derek's upscale suburban home, the extravagance of it all now glaringly conspicuous. Caleb rang the doorbell, and after a few moments Derek answered, his face falling when he saw us. "Meredith? Caleb, what brings you two here so early?" he asked, eyes darting between us suspiciously. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "We need to talk, Derek. It's about the company." His expression hardened and he stepped back, ushering us inside. "What about it?" "Don't play dumb, Derek," Caleb interjected, his tone stern. "Lila told us everything, the embezzlement, the illegal activities. It all ends now." Derek's face contorted with rage, and he slammed his fist against the wall. "That little brat! How dare she stick her nose where it doesn't belong?" "She's your daughter, Derek," I cried, appalled by his callous reaction. "How could you put your own family at risk like this?" He whirled towards me, his eyes wild. "Don't you dare lecture me about family, Meredith. You have no idea what I've had to do to provide for all of you." "By stealing? By breaking the law?" Caleb's voice boomed, his composure fraying. "You've not only betrayed your company, but also your own flesh and blood." Derek let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Says the man who made a career out of locking people up. You're no better than I am, Caleb." The tension in the room was palpable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. I placed a hand on Caleb's arm, silently pleading with him to remain calm. "We're not here to fight, Derek," I said, my voice trembling. "We just want the truth." Derek's shoulders sagged, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of remorse in his eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. "Fine, you want the truth?" he spat. "I did what I had to do to keep this family afloat. After the divorce, I was drowning in debt, and the company was my only lifeline. You think they would have cared if I went under? If Lila and her mother ended up on the streets?" His words hung in the air, a twisted justification for his crimes. Caleb shook his head, his jaw clenched. "That doesn't make it right, Derek. You've broken the law, and there will be consequences." Derek's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, his voice lowering to a menacing whisper. "You're not going to do anything, Caleb. Not if you know what's good for you and your precious little family." The veiled threat hung heavy between us, and I felt a chill run down my spine. In that moment, I realized that the brother I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a man consumed by greed and desperation. As we left Derek's house, the weight of his actions bearing down on us, I couldn't help but wonder if we had just opened Pandora's box, and what horrors might lie ahead. Derek's thinly veiled threat hung over us like a dark cloud as we left his house. Caleb's jaw was set in a grim line, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. "That arrogant son of a—" he muttered under his breath, his words trailing off into a frustrated sigh. I placed a hand on his arm, trying to calm him. "Caleb, what are we going to do? He's not going to just roll over and admit his guilt." Caleb's eyes met mine, a steely determination burning within them. "Then we'll make him. I'm not going to let that scumbag get away with what he's done." In that moment, I saw a glimpse of the tenacious prosecutor Caleb had once been, a man who wouldn't rest until justice was served. "Where do we start?" I asked, my voice wavering slightly. "We start by gathering evidence," Caleb replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Anything we can find that proves Derek's involvement in this embezzlement scheme." The days that followed were a whirlwind of covert investigation. Caleb pored over financial records, cross-referencing dates and transactions, building an ironclad case against my brother. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. as if I were betraying my own flesh and blood. "I know this is hard for you, Meredith," Caleb said one evening, his voice softer than usual. "But Derek made his choices, and now he has to face the consequences." I nodded, fighting back tears. He's my brother, Caleb. How could he do something like this?" Caleb reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "Greed can make even the most trusted people do terrible things, but we can't let that blind us to the truth." As the evidence mounted, a clearer picture began to emerge. Derek had been systematically siphoning funds from the company for years, using his position to cover his tracks. But it wasn't just the money. He had also been manipulating and threatening those closest to him, including his estranged wife, Elise, and their daughter, Lila. "That bastard," Caleb growled, slamming his fist on the table as we reviewed the latest findings. "He's been holding Elise and Lila hostage this whole time, using their fear and his control over their finances to keep them quiet." I felt sick to my stomach, the depth of Derek's depravity hitting me like a ton of bricks. This was no longer just about embezzlement. It was about protecting my family from a man who had descended into a pit of moral corruption. Caleb's eyes met mine, his gaze unwavering. "We have to stop him, Meredith, no matter what it takes." In that moment, I knew there was no turning back. Derek had made his choices, and now it was up to us to make ours, to stand up against his wickedness and bring him to justice, no matter the cost. As the days wore on, the weight of Derek's crimes began to take its toll. At work, whispers and sideways glances followed me through the corridors, my connection to the unfolding scandal like a scarlet letter. "How could you not have known, Meredith?" Janet, a coworker, asked one day, her voice dripping with judgment. I clenched my fists, biting back the urge to lash out. My brother's actions are his own. I had no idea he was capable of such deceit. Janet shook her head, her lips pursed. "Well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it?" The comment stung, and I fought back tears as I retreated to my office, slamming the door behind me. How dare she insinuate that I was somehow complicit in Derek's crimes? The ringing of my phone startled me, and I snatched it up, struggling to compose myself. "Hello? Aunt Meredith?" It was Lila, her voice trembling. "I need your help." My heart sank, and a wave of dread washed over me. "What's wrong, honey?" "It's Dad," she choked out between sobs. "He found out I told you and Uncle Caleb everything. He's furious, and he's threatening to cut me off completely." I could feel the anger bubbling within me, a protective instinct kicking in. "That bastard," I growled. "Don't worry, Lila. We'll take care of this." Hanging up, I wasted no time in calling Caleb, relaying the situation with urgency. His voice was grim, but resolute. "I'll be right there. We're not letting him get away with this anymore." Within the hour, Caleb was at my office, his expression thunderous. He pulled me into a fierce embrace, and I could feel the tension radiating off him. "That son of a bitch has gone too far," he seethed. "Threatening his own daughter like that, it's unforgivable." I nodded, steeling myself for the confrontation to come. "We have to stop him, Caleb, before he hurts Lila or anyone else." The drive to Derek's house was a blur, my mind racing with a million different scenarios. What would we find when we got there? Would Derek be reasonable, or would his desperation drive him to new lows? The moment we stepped onto his doorstep, the air was thick with hostility. Derek flung open the door, his face contorted with rage. "What do you two want now?" he spat, his eyes darting between us. Caleb stepped forward, his stance unwavering. "We're here to put an end to your little charade, Derek. The threats, the manipulation, it all stops now." Derek's laughter was like nails on a chalkboard. "Or what? You'll throw me in jail? You don't have the guts, Caleb." In a flash, Caleb had Derek pinned against the wall, his forearm pressed against his throat. "Don't test me, Derek. I won't let you hurt my family anymore." The venom in Caleb's voice sent a chill down my spine, but I knew he was right. We had reached our breaking point, and there was no turning back. As Derek struggled against Caleb's grip, his eyes met mine, and in that moment I saw the true depth of his depravity. This was no longer the brother I had known and loved. This was a monster, consumed by greed and willing to crush anyone who stood in his way. The die was cast, and the battle lines were drawn. It was us against Derek, a fight for survival and redemption. And as I watched the two men grapple, I knew that no matter the outcome, our lives would never be the same again. The confrontation with Derek had been a stark wake-up call, a reminder that we were dealing with a man who had fully embraced his own depravity. As Caleb and I regrouped, the weight of the task before us seemed more daunting than ever. "We can't take him on alone," Caleb said, his brow furrowed in thought. "He's too desperate, too willing to cross any line to protect himself." I nodded, my mind already racing with possibilities. "What about Elise? She's been living under his thumb for years. She might be willing to help us bring him down." Caleb's eyes lit up, a glimmer of hope flickering in their depths. "That's brilliant, Meredith. If we can get her on our side, it'll be a major blow to Derek's defenses." Reaching out to Elise was a delicate process, shrouded in secrecy to protect her from Derek's wrath. But when we finally met, the pain and resentment in her eyes were palpable. "That bastard has made my life a living hell," she spat, her knuckles white from gripping the table. "He's threatened me, controlled every aspect of my existence, all to keep me quiet about his little schemes." Caleb leaned forward, his voice low and reassuring. "Not anymore, Elise. We're going to stop him, but we need your help." The fire in Elise's eyes was unmistakable, a burning desire for justice that had been simmering for far too long. "Whatever it takes," she said firmly. "I'm done living in fear." With Elise on board, the pieces began to fall into place. Caleb's contacts from his days as a prosecutor proved invaluable as we slowly built a network of allies, disgruntled employees, forensic accountants, anyone who could help us unravel the tangled web of Derek's crimes. But as our efforts intensified, so did Derek's desperation. Lila reported increasingly erratic behavior, outbursts of rage, and thinly veiled threats. It was clear that he was starting to sense the noose tightening around him. "We have to be careful," Caleb warned during one of our clandestine meetings. "Derek's like a caged animal right now, and there's no telling how far he'll go to protect himself." The tension was palpable, a constant undercurrent of danger lurking beneath the surface. But we were resolved, united in our determination to bring Derek's reign of terror to an end. Late one night, as I sat poring over financial records, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was one of Caleb's contacts, his voice laced with urgency. "We've got him," the man said breathlessly. "Ironclad evidence of fraud, money laundering, the whole 9 yards. It's time to make our move." I felt a rush of adrenaline, the moment we'd been working towards finally within reach. Quickly, I relayed the news to Caleb and our team, setting the wheels in motion for the final confrontation. As I looked around the room at the determined faces of our allies, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and gratitude. We had started this journey alone, but now we were a force to be reckoned with, a band of unlikely heroes united against a common enemy. Derek's downfall was imminent, and as we prepared for the final showdown, I knew that no matter the outcome, we had already won a victory. We had refused to cower in fear, and we had built a network of allies strong enough to take on even the most formidable foe. The stage was set, and the curtain was about to rise on the ultimate act of reckoning. Derek's reign of terror was coming to an end, and we were ready to face him head-on, armed with the truth and a resolve that could not be broken. The day of reckoning had arrived, and the air was thick with tension as we gathered in the conference room at Caleb's law firm. Elise sat beside me, her hands trembling slightly, while Lila fidgeted nervously in her chair. The weight of what was about to transpire hung heavy over us all. Caleb entered the room, a grim expression etched onto his face. "It's time," he said, his voice low and resolute. We followed him down the corridor, our footsteps echoing off the walls like a funeral march. As we approached the boardroom, the muffled sounds of raised voices filtered through the doors. Derek was already inside, surrounded by members of the company's board. Caleb paused, turning to face us. "Remember, no matter what happens in there, we stay calm and focused. This is our chance to bring Derek's reign of terror to an end, once and for all." With a deep breath, he pushed open the doors, and we filed into the room. Derek's eyes widened in surprise, his gaze flickering between us and the board members. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice dripping with disdain. One of the board members, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Whitmore, fixed him with a steely glare. "We've been made aware of some rather disturbing allegations against you, Mr. Reynolds. Allegations of embezzlement, fraud, and misconduct." Derek scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. Preposterous. These are nothing more than baseless accusations from disgruntled employees and family members with personal vendettas. Caleb stepped forward, a thick file clutched in his hand. I'm afraid the evidence speaks for itself, Derek. Bank records, financial statements, eyewitness accounts. It all points to a systematic and calculated effort to siphon funds from this company for your own personal gain. The color drained from Derek's face as Caleb began presenting the damning evidence, each document and testimony like a nail in the coffin of his deceit. You've been living a lie, Derek, Caleb said, his voice ringing out in the silent room. And not just with this company, but with your own family as well. Elise rose to her feet, her eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and resolve. He's right. For years, Derek has manipulated and threatened me, using our finances as a weapon to keep me silent about his misdeeds. Lila followed suit, her voice trembling but resolute. He's even turned on me, his own daughter, when I discovered the truth about his crimes. Derek's eyes darted around the room, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before our eyes. This is absurd, he sputtered, his face flushed with rage. You have no proof, no concrete evidence. But Caleb was ready, producing a final damning piece of evidence. A recorded phone conversation between Derek and one of his co-conspirators, detailing the intricate web of fraud and money laundering. As the recording played, the silence in the room was deafening, a palpable sense of shock and disbelief hanging in the air. When the final words faded, Derek slumped back in his chair, defeated. The weight of his crimes had finally caught up to him, and there was nowhere left to run. Mrs. Whitmore cleared her throat, her gaze fixed on Derek with a mixture of disgust and disappointment. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented here today, the board has no choice but to terminate your employment with this company, effective immediately. Derek's head snapped up, his eyes wild and desperate. You can't do this. I built this company from the ground up. But his protests fell on deaf ears as the board members turned their backs on him, one by one. In that moment, I saw the true depth of Derek's fall, a once powerful man reduced to a pathetic, sniveling mess, his lies and betrayals laid bare for all to see. As security escorted him from the building, Caleb placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. It's over, Meredith, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Justice has been served. I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders, but the victory was bittersweet. Derek's downfall had come at a great personal cost, tearing our family apart and exposing the darkest corners of human greed and depravity. But as I looked around at the faces of those who had stood by us, Elise, Lila, our allies in the shadows, I knew that we had emerged from this ordeal stronger, united by a shared commitment to truth and accountability. The path ahead would be long and difficult, but in that moment, I knew that we had taken the first steps towards redemption, towards healing the wounds that Derek had inflicted upon us all. The aftermath of Derek's downfall was a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media scrutiny. As the details of his crimes made headlines, the public outrage was palpable, a collective sense of betrayal and disbelief that someone in such a position of power could stoop to such depravity. Through it all, Caleb stood by my side, a steadfast pillar of strength and unwavering determination. We're not done yet, he would remind me, his jaw set in a grim line. Derek needs to face the full consequences of his actions, and face them he did. The criminal charges came swiftly, a laundry list of offenses that would make even the most hardened criminal wince: fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and more. As the court proceedings unfolded, the extent of Derek's deception was laid bare, each revelation more shocking than the last. Elise took the stand, her testimony detailing the years of emotional and financial abuse she had endured at Derek's hands. He made me feel like a prisoner in my own life, she said, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. Always dangling the threat of financial ruin over my head, using our daughter as leverage to keep me in line. Lila's testimony was equally damning, painting a picture of a man so consumed by greed and ambition that he was willing to sacrifice his own family on the altar of his desires. As the evidence mounted, Derek's arrogance slowly crumbled, his once boastful demeanor replaced by a sullen, defeated hunch. When the guilty verdict was finally read, a hush fell over the courtroom, the weight of the moment almost palpable. "Derek Reynolds, you have been found guilty on all counts," the judge intoned, his voice ringing out like a death knell. "In light of the severity of your crimes and the devastating impact they have had on countless lives, I hereby sentence you to 25 years in a federal penitentiary." The words hung in the air, a collective sigh of relief and vindication rippling through the room. Derek's face was ashen, his eyes vacant, as the reality of his situation finally set in. In the days that followed, Caleb worked tirelessly to ensure that Elise and Lila were provided for, securing a substantial divorce settlement and financial compensation for the years of anguish they had endured. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but an important one nonetheless. As for me, the weight of Derek's betrayal still hung heavy on my heart. He was my brother, my own flesh and blood, and yet he had shown no hesitation in sacrificing everything: our family, our bond, our trust, in pursuit of his own selfish desires. "You did the right thing, Meredith," Caleb would remind me, his arms wrapped around me in a comforting embrace. "Derek made his choices, and now he's facing the consequences." And slowly, gradually, I began to heal. The wounds inflicted by Derek's actions were deep, but with the love and support of Caleb, Elise, and Lila, I found the strength to move forward, to reclaim the pieces of my life that had been shattered. It was during one of our regular family dinners, a ritual we had reestablished in the wake of Derek's downfall, that I finally found a sense of closure. As we gathered around the table, the laughter and warmth a stark contrast to the darkness we had endured, I looked around at the faces of those I loved most. Elise, her eyes shining with a newfound sense of freedom and empowerment. Lila, her smile radiant and unencumbered by the weight of her father's sins. And Caleb, my rock, my unwavering source of strength and love. In that moment, I realized that while Derek had tried to tear us apart, he had ultimately failed. Our bonds had been tested, but they had emerged stronger than ever, forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by our collective resolve. As I raised my glass, a sense of gratitude washed over me. "To family," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "and to the journey that has brought us here, stronger and more resilient than ever before." The echoes of agreement filled the room, a testament to the power of love and perseverance in the face of even the darkest of trials. Derek's fate was sealed, his legacy one of greed and betrayal. But for us, a new chapter was unfolding, one filled with hope, redemption, and the promise of brighter days ahead. The days leading up to Derek's sentencing were a whirlwind of emotions. Caleb and I had spent countless hours preparing our victim impact statements, poring over every detail, every heartache Derek had inflicted upon us. "This is our chance to have our voices heard," Caleb said, his brow furrowed in concentration, "to make sure Derek understands the true gravity of his actions." When the day finally arrived, the courtroom was packed, a sea of faces eager to witness the final act of reckoning. Derek was led in, his once imposing figure now diminished, his eyes downcast and hollow. As I took the stand, my hands trembled, but my voice was steady, fueled by a deep well of resolve. "Derek Reynolds was once my brother, my own flesh and blood," I began, my words ringing out in the hushed courtroom. "But the man who sits before us today is a stranger, a shell of the person I once knew and loved." I recounted the pain, the betrayal, the utter devastation Derek's actions had wrought upon our family, how his greed had nearly torn us apart, leaving scars that may never fully heal. "You had everything, Derek," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "A loving family, a successful career, a life that so many would envy. And yet, it wasn't enough. Your insatiable greed drove you to sacrifice it all, to burn every bridge and crush anyone who stood in your way." Derek's eyes remained fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched, but I could see the flicker of shame in his expression. When it was Caleb's turn, he did not hold back, his words lashing out like whips against Derek's battered ego. "You are a coward, Derek Reynolds," Caleb said, his voice dripping with disdain. "A selfish, manipulative coward who thought he could bend the world to his will, consequences be damned." He recounted the threats, the emotional and financial abuse Derek had inflicted upon Elise and Lila, his own daughter. "What kind of man does that?" Caleb thundered. "What kind of soulless monster preys upon his own family for personal gain?" Derek flinched, his hands balling into fists, but he remained silent, his head bowed in silent submission. As the judge handed down Derek's sentence, 25 years with no possibility of parole, a sense of finality settled over the courtroom. It was done. The monster had been caged, and justice had been served. In the weeks that followed, a strange sense of calm descended upon our lives. The storm had passed, leaving us battered but ultimately stronger for having weathered it together. Elise and Lila found solace in their newfound freedom, slowly rebuilding their lives from the ashes of Derek's destruction. Lila, in particular, blossomed, her smile radiant and unencumbered by the weight of her father's sins. "It's like a weight has been lifted," she confided in me one day, her eyes shining with hope. "I can finally breathe again, without the constant fear of his wrath hanging over me." As for Caleb and me, our bond had been forged in the fires of adversity, tempered by our shared commitment to truth and justice. We had faced the darkness head-on and emerged on the other side, battered but unbroken. It was during one of our regular family dinners that I truly felt the weight of what we had endured and what we had overcome. As we gathered around the table, the laughter and warmth a stark contrast to the darkness we had faced, I looked around at the faces of those I loved most. Elise, her eyes shining with a newfound sense of freedom and empowerment. Lila, her smile radiant and unencumbered by the weight of her father's sins. And Caleb, my rock, my unwavering source of strength and love. In that moment I realized that while Derek had tried to tear us apart, he had ultimately failed. Our bonds had been tested, but they had emerged stronger than ever, forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by our collective resolve. As I raised my glass, a sense of gratitude washed over me. "To family," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "and to the journey that has brought us here, stronger and more resilient than ever before." The echoes of agreement filled the room, a testament to the power of love and perseverance in the face of even the darkest of trials. Derek's fate was sealed, his legacy one of greed and betrayal. But for us, a new chapter was unfolding, one filled with hope, redemption, and the promise of brighter days ahead.
My grandmother soaked a towel and made a rustling sound, then said, "It's done. Now try." I asked, "Grandmother, what do you mean?" She replied, "Do as you wish. Please like and subscribe." I was left in my grandmother's hands and grew up in her care. My grandmother was someone who gave me infinite love. It seems that even such a grandmother had human desires. I was born in the countryside. I heard that my father left home when I was a baby because he had wanderlust. My mother and I lived together until she went to the city to work, in a factory to earn money. At that time, I was 4 years old. My mother left me with my maternal grandmother when she went to the city. It was a fact I learned later. But my maternal grandmother was my mother's stepmother. My maternal grandfather was living alone with my mother. Then he remarried, and that person is the grandmother I'm talking about now. Despite her young age, my grandmother lived a hard life, working in the fields due to poor family circumstances. My maternal grandfather, a wealthy widower, gave some land to my grandmother's parents and started living with my grandmother. So the age difference between my grandmother and my mother is only 16 years. The age difference between my grandmother and me is less than 40 years. When I went to the market with my grandmother in my childhood, many people thought I was my grandmother's son. Not only was my grandmother young, but she was naturally youthful. From a young age, my grandmother held me and put me to sleep. My uncle is my grandmother's son, but my grandmother loved and cherished me the child of her stepdaughter, more. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about our family situation, but they found it strange that my grandmother loved me so much. It must have been a bit strange to love a grandson, who was the child of a stepdaughter, more than her own child. One of the men in the neighborhood said this: "There are children or grandchildren that we love more, but there's no reason for it." My uncle was also very good to me. Since our age difference was not too big, we spent time like brothers. When I was in elementary school, I thought this: I will definitely repay my grandmother and uncle when I grow up. When I was in the second grade of elementary school, my mother remarried. She married a man who worked at the same factory, and he was a single father raising 2 children. As a child, I didn't think much about it. But as I became a middle school student, I felt anger toward my mother. How could she leave her own son to someone else and raise someone else's children? Because of these thoughts, I hated my mother. As I was hating my mother, I had some periods of wandering. However, thinking about my grandmother and uncle, I didn't wander for long. My uncle, who took me around during my wandering, helped soothe my empty heart. When I was in high school, my uncle got married. After living with us for a year after getting married, my uncle moved to the city. It was lonely living with just my grandmother. My grandmother loved me terribly, but we didn't have great conversations. My grandmother was the type of person who lived with a farming tool in her hand. When I came home from school, I helped with my grandmother's farming work. I thought this was natural, but it seems like I appeared as a diligent child in the eyes of the neighborhood because I helped my grandmother with her work. I received a lot of praise from the adults in the neighborhood. My grandmother was always proud of me. After graduating high school and becoming an adult, I started working in a city near our village. Living the 3-shift factory life was not that hard. The fact that the money I earned was helping my family made me very proud. However, it seemed like my grandmother was always worried about me living in a dormitory. She was always curious whether I was eating properly and doing my job. When I went home on the weekends, my grandmother prepared a feast for me. I had to eat until I was about to burst because I didn't want to upset my grandmother. Even though it was painful to eat so much, I ate and ate the food my grandmother prepared because I didn't want her to be upset. I once told my grandmother to stop working with the money my uncle sent and the money I earned. I didn't think my grandmother needed to work, but my grandmother smiled and said she liked working. In my eyes, my grandmother seemed old, and I told her to stop working. But now I realize that my grandmother was a young age, not even 50. On my grandmother's birthday, my uncle's family came to our house, and it was bustling for the first time in a while. The sound of having a quiet conversation with my grandmother was all that was heard in our house. But it was so enjoyable because it was busy. At that time, my cousins were at an age where they were very noisy, and they were so cute that I think I liked them even more. When my cousins cried, I comforted them, and if they asked for something, I did everything for them. My uncle did the same for me, so I did the same for my uncle's children. According to my aunt, my cousins wanted to see me every day. When I was working at the factory, I often thought of my cousins. On my grandmother's birthday, my uncle's family stayed the night at our house. The room I used to sleep in was taken by my uncle's family, and I slept with my grandmother. My uncle and aunt had a great relationship. Even when they stayed at our house, they always had sex before going to sleep. I could always hear that sound. In the quiet countryside, that faint sound made my heart flutter. When I heard that sound, I couldn't sleep and tossed and turned. That night, my grandmother talked to me as I was tossing and turning, unable to sleep. When my grandmother asked if I couldn't sleep, I said that I must have eaten too much for dinner. My grandmother said, "You should get married soon." I wanted to get married soon too, but I said to my grandmother, "What about you if I get married?" "I'm not getting married." My grandmother got angry at me. "I'm me, and you should get married when it's time." "What are you talking about?" I raised my voice and said, "Anyway, I'm not getting married. I'm going to take care of you for the rest of my life." I heard my grandmother sobbing. Whether she was moved by what I said, or whether she was sorry for our poverty, I don't know. But my grandmother was crying. As I was talking with my grandmother, I heard my aunt open the door and come out. She was coming out to wash after having sex. The sound of my aunt washing was heard for a moment, and then the sound of her urinating was heard. The sound was so loud. My grandmother and I didn't say anything because we thought my aunt might be embarrassed. So the sound of my aunt urinating sounded even louder after my aunt returned to her room. My grandmother and I continued our conversation. She warned me to be careful with women, which made me laugh. "Grandma, who would want someone like me?" At this, my grandmother sternly responded, "What's wrong with my grandson?" I laughed again at her words. "Grandma, women don't even look at a guy like me." "I don't have any thoughts about them either," my grandmother cautiously asked. "So you don't want to get married?" When she asked this, I blurted, "I do want to get married. On days like today, I envy Uncle." I was worried because I thought my grandmother might misunderstand. She said, "You have to endure even when it's hard. Not only women but men too, if they act recklessly, they end up disgraced." All I could say weakly was, "Uh-huh, I understand. Are you having a hard time?" "What do you mean?" "You know that thing." She couldn't articulate her words properly. I replied, "It's bearable." When she heard this, she simply said, "I see." She kept asking if I was having a hard time. I got a bit irritated and said, "Ah, Grandma, please stop asking. Can you solve it?" I said this with an angry voice. She didn't say anything and stayed quiet. I also remained quiet because I felt like I shouldn't say anything. After a while, I turned around in bed, and she asked me in a quiet voice, "Can't you sleep?" "Yes." I was startled by her next words. "Are you in pain?" "What?" I asked, surprised. She said, "I'm your grandmother. You can tell me." "Are you in pain?" After saying this, she sighed deeply. "Wait a moment, okay?" I didn't understand what she meant, so I didn't say anything. She wet a towel and made a rustling noise, then said, "It's done. Now, try it." "Grandma, what do you mean?" I asked. She replied, "Do whatever you want to do." At this, I was speechless. She sighed and said, "This is a secret between us, understand?" Then she climbed on top of me as I lay there. She kept repeating, "We don't share a drop of blood." It seemed like she wanted to justify what we were doing. My mother was her stepdaughter, and so we didn't share any blood relation, which she thought could justify our actions. That's probably why she kept repeating it. After a whirlwind of events, I fell into sleep. The next morning, I was playing in the yard with my younger cousins. "Mom, let's go," my uncle said. And I had no choice but to say a regretful goodbye to my cousins. they cried, refusing to leave until they were scolded by my aunt, and followed her out. When I returned home after seeing off my uncle's family, my grandmother asked me to sit down. "Did you sleep well yesterday?" I nodded silently. She asked me when I would return to the dormitory, and I told her I would go in the evening. She told me she had taken a bath while I was seeing off my uncle. I didn't understand what she meant, so she said, "Make sure you sleep well in the dormitory." When I replied, "Huh?" she said, "We don't share a drop of blood." So, that day, I spent the afternoon with my grandmother. She kept repeating, "We don't share a drop of blood." I missed my grandmother a lot when I was staying at the dormitory. When I went home on the weekends, she seemed to like me even more than before. Looking back, I think her life was happier because of our relationship. She was always waiting for me when I arrived home on Saturday afternoons. Before, when I would go home on Saturdays, she would be working in the fields and come in to prepare dinner. But after that day, she would come home, bathe, and greet me before I arrived. From Saturday afternoon to Monday morning, I spent time with my grandmother and then returned to the dormitory. Once, I went home during the day on a weekday. My grandmother was working in the scorching sun. "Grandma!" She was startled by my call. "Oh, my child, how did you get here?" she said. "I came because I was sick." She looked at me with surprised eyes, and I smiled. Realizing she smiled back, she said, "Let's finish this and go home," and continued her work. She hurriedly worked and urinated while sitting in the field. She let out a loud fart and looked at me, laughing shyly. I went to her, and she finished her work. She hit my arm and said, "What if someone sees?" And again, she said, "We don't share a drop of blood." So, and I took her home. She always expressed her desire this way. We don't share a drop of blood. So, at some point, if I didn't approach her, she would express her feelings to me this way.
Growing up, I often felt overshadowed, with my parents distant and preoccupied with work. Books became my refuge, offering an escape from the loneliness that followed me into my teenage years. I craved connection, someone to fill the emptiness I carried with me. That all changed when I met Anne-Marie Santos in middle school. She brightened my life, and our friendship quickly evolved into a romance that lasted through high school, college, and eventually marriage. I knew from the start that I wanted her in my life forever, despite my parents' concerns. We were close, but maintained our own lives. Yet the moments we shared were always the most special. She was my best friend, and I made her my wife. Anne-Marie and I were opposites in many ways. She was outgoing, I was reserved. She was athletic, and I was more academic. Despite our differences, we had a genuine connection that kept us together. We never forced our relationship, but we always prioritized each other, sharing everything from dreams to fears. I wasn't sure if I believed in soulmates, but if they existed, she was mine. When I asked her father for her hand in marriage, he questioned everything, and I had to prove my love for her. I made a choice to love her, through good times and bad. Unfortunately, the worst came only 3 years later. I still loved her and wanted her happiness, even if it meant sacrificing my own. In recent months, Anne-Marie had become distant, coming home late and no longer smiling when she saw me. The realization that the person you love no longer loves you is devastating. One evening, she quietly entered the dining room, and I noticed the change in her demeanor. "Hi, Annie." "Hey, Gavin. Are you okay?" "Not really. Please sit so I can explain." I had rehearsed this moment, knowing I had to make the hardest decision of my life, letting you go. "Annie, I love you and always will. I don't want to argue or accuse. I just want us to decide together what's best, okay?" "Of course, Gavin. What's going on?" Her anxious eyes gave her away. "Annie, I've always wanted your happiness, but I know you're not happy with me." She teared up, and oddly, it was a comfort to see she was upset. I don't want to dig into details. It'll just hurt more. But if we can agree you're unhappy, it'd mean a lot, she whispered. Yes, Gavin, I know. Thank you. Your honesty reassures me I'm making the right choice. I want a divorce. Miguel Santos was a man I respected deeply. He and his wife, Maria, raised 8 kids in a small house in a tough neighborhood. He was strong and tough, but it was his loyalty to his family that impressed me most. I owed him an explanation, so I sat with him on his porch over a few beers and finally told him, Mijo, why are you here? It's harder than I thought. Sir, I've loved no one but your daughter since I first met her. I promised you I'd always put her first, and that's what I'm doing now, even though I'm leaving Anne-Marie. As expected, he was angry, mixing English and Spanish in his demand for an explanation I couldn't fully give. Sir, I love your daughter, but some things have to stay between us. It hurts to admit our marriage has failed, but I believe it's for the best. I wanted you to hear it from me. Eventually, he calmed down enough to let me share some details. Though upset and embarrassed, he allowed me to leave without further confrontation. Anne-Marie didn't cry or argue, and while I was relieved, a small part of me wished she'd begged me to stay. But she didn't, and that confirmed my decision. Her only reaction was when I mentioned talking to her father. I spoke to your dad today and explained what I'm about to tell you. I hope we can part ways quickly. I don't want financial ruin on top of everything else. I've prepared the paperwork for dividing our assets, especially the house. Please review them and let me know by next week. Okay, Gavin, I'll review them. I can already hear the criticism. Why not go after her and her lover? First, I don't have those skills. The last fight I got into was in high school when someone made Anne-Marie cry. I almost got expelled for it, but Miguel Santos helped keep things quiet. The second reason was my own mental health. I was a wreck, losing sleep, and almost got fired. I had no one to turn to. My mom died of chest cancer in college, and my dad, who became a hard drinker, moved to Florida and cut off contact. I needed a fresh start, and to do that, Anne-Marie had to agree to the divorce. I was only 25 and needed to rebuild my life. Revenge wasn't on my mind. 2 weeks later, we sat in the attorney's office. Anne-Marie gave up the house, which we agreed to sell. We split our accounts, and she kept the new car while I kept my old truck. Everything was settled except for the 90-day waiting period. The only thing I regretted was lying to Anne-Marie. Where are you going to live, Gavin? I rented a small apartment near the office. I'll stay there until I figure things out. Good. I guess I'll see you at the house closing, right? Absolutely. See you soon, Annie. In reality, I wasn't staying. My truck was packed, and I left my wedding ring on the kitchen table with a note that read, "Goodbye. I will always love you. Be happy." Before leaving town, I said goodbye to Miguel Santos. Mijo, you and Anne-Marie belong together. Can't there be forgiveness? Remember your vows? Yes, it's too fast. Sir, I've forgiven her in my heart. I love your daughter, but I need peace. Maria Santos hugged me at the door. As she let me go, she softly said, God bless you, mijo. I will miss you. I left quickly before I broke down. When your spouse is unhappy, it's helpful to know why, but I had no clue. Little things had come up, like leaving the toilet seat up, but recently we hadn't even argued. I thought maybe she was stressed with work, but she said she'd be fine. Trying to improve things, I did more around the house, cooking, dishes, laundry, hoping she'd notice. After a few weeks, I even cleaned the bathroom, a chore I hated. If I hadn't cleaned it, I might not have found out. I wouldn't have emptied the trash and discovered the pregnancy test. I dug deeper and found a positive test, then checked the birth control pills. They were untouched. That's when I realized another man had gotten my wife pregnant. But who? It didn't take long to figure out. I called Anne-Marie, intending to ask, but her number was forwarded to the front desk. They said she had already left. Her car was still in the lot, so I drove to her office. About 20 minutes later, my hope that she had an accident vanished. 30 minutes later, I had my answer. Her boss, Michael James, pulled up next to her car. They kissed openly. My smile, once hers, was now for someone else. That was all I needed to know. I got home ahead of her and hid my feelings that night. She barely looked my way. In just over 2 hours, I knew my marriage was over and realized it was a 20-hour drive to Las Vegas. I made the trip in 4 days, driving through Nebraska, Colorado, and Utah. The peaceful scenery slowed me down, and I wasn't sure if my truck could handle the terrain. On the 4th day, I checked into a hotel, slept for 18 hours, and spent the next day filling out housing applications. Less than a week earlier, I was a newly divorced 25-year-old with no family. Now I was a first-year law student in a dorm room, starting a new life. I wish I could share stories of new adventures after college, but the reality was different. I had no experience dating. Gavin and Anne-Marie had always been a pair. I had no idea where to start. During law school, I never went on a single date or made close friends. If anyone showed interest, I missed the signs. Instead, I buried myself in studies, using school as an escape. I spent 4 years earning my Juris Doctor and MBA, aiming for a 4.0 GPA. Anne-Marie and I once talked about going back to school when we were financially stable. So, when I moved on, I took the LSAT, applied to schools, and got accepted in Las Vegas with a full scholarship. I didn't know much about the school or the city, just that it was far from home. Once a month, I'd write to Mr. and Mrs. Santos about my studies. It was a habit I picked up from my parents, perhaps out of routine or a need to feel someone cared. 13 weeks into my first semester, I received a package confirming the exact value of my broken heart, $7,642 after fees. It was probably the third most depressing day of my life. Occasionally, I'd get an email from Miguel or Maria Santos. I never told them where I really was, and they never asked. They'd share updates about their other children, but never about Anne-Marie, letting me imagine I still had a family that cared. For the first 6 or 7 months, I kept in touch. They never explicitly mentioned forgiveness or reconciliation, but hinted at it until, suddenly, the hints stopped. I never doubted Anne-Marie would keep her baby. But I wondered if she'd tell her parents the truth before it became obvious. I also wondered if Michael James would leave his wife and 3 kids to do right by Anne-Marie. I didn't have the courage to ask. But I knew a child born to a black man wouldn't look like me. I felt like a coward when I sent flowers, balloons, and a gift basket to the James home, congratulating them on the baby. I sent a duplicate to Anne-Marie's office, addressed to the company president. I promised myself I wouldn't stoop to hurting anyone, even Michael James, but the pain was too much. I didn't spread rumors, just offered my congratulations. I was genuinely happy for Anne-Marie, knowing she was working toward her dream of a big family, but I couldn't ignore that her happiness came at the cost of my pain. Without knowing what happened after my gifts, I imagined a disastrous outcome for Michael James, however unlikely. This small, cowardly act allowed me to close that chapter of my life. I was still hurting, but it was over. My social life suffered for years after the divorce. My first real friend was a colleague 20 years older. I joined a small law firm specializing in real estate, where I found I had a knack for contracts, numbers, and eventually, people. Gavin, people need to trust you to solve their problems. They hand you the keys to their dreams, and you have to deliver. You've got a gift, and I'll help you use it. David Rothschild, the senior partner, became more than just my boss. He was my mentor and life coach. A legend in real estate law, he was known for negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. He made me his next project, and just 90 days into my career, he gave me my first evaluation. Gavin, you're dedicated and meticulous. You do excellent work. Thank you, Mr. Rothschild. But as a person, you're completely out of touch. Are you 30 or 90? Let's go for a walk. That's how our weekly Gavin project meetings began. Rothschild was brilliant. He'd ask questions, let me talk, and share stories. I opened up about everything: my life, parents, law school, and Anne-Marie. We have a lot to work on, but also a lot to work with. Now, let's get back to the office. At first, I didn't understand his motives, but after 3 years, the results were clear. His subtle guidance helped me grow. I started going to the gym, learning to cook, making better investments, and buying real estate. Without his help, I might have had a nice middle-class life. With it, I became a confident, successful business person. Rothschild never wanted credit, saying, "Watching you succeed is thanks enough." I worked with Rothschild for almost 5 years. After helping me succeed in business, he turned his focus to my personal life. One day, he casually asked, "Gavin, what are you getting your parents for their anniversary?" I was confused since both my parents had passed away, and he knew that. "Come on, Gavin. Next month, Miguel and Maria Santos will be married for 50 years. Only a jackass wouldn't mark an event like that." He was right. The Santos were like parents to me. I kept in touch with them, sending messages and gifts. For their 50th anniversary, I gave them the best: first-class airfare, a 5-star hotel stay, a limo, fine dining, and VIP show tickets in Las Vegas. I sent it with a note: "Happy anniversary. Use these as you wish. Love, Gavin." I didn't expect anything in return. So I was surprised when I received a call at noon the next day. "Gavin O'Connor," I answered. "Oh, mijo, what a wonderful surprise." "But this is too much," Mrs. Santos exclaimed. "Mrs. Santos, it's lovely to hear from you, but you and your husband deserve this, and I'm honored to give it to you," I replied warmly. "Oh, Gavin, you've always been such a wonderful boy. Un momento. Miguel wants to talk," she said, handing the phone to her husband. "Gavin," Mr. Santos began. "Yes, sir," I responded, knowing what was coming. "Gavin, this is too much. I can't let you go to such lengths. I can't imagine the cost. It's too much," he continued, his words rushing out. "Senor Santos, Miguel, Papa," I interrupted gently. "Yes, Gavin," he replied, finally pausing. "This gift doesn't even begin to repay the kindness you've shown me over the years. It brings me joy to give it to you. Please accept it in the spirit it was intended," I said sincerely. After a brief silence, he responded, "Si, mijo, we accept." "Wonderful. Happy anniversary," I said, feeling relieved. The conversation shifted to the trip details, and I explained all the highlights I thought they'd enjoy. After exchanging many words of gratitude and love, we ended the call, and for the first time in nearly a decade, I felt a sense of peace. As I reflected on that, I noticed Rothschild standing in my doorway with a big grin on his face. "Damn ungrateful kids," he teased. "Shut up, old man," I shot back with a smile. The Santos vacation didn't unfold as I had expected. I assumed they'd use the gift for sightseeing, fine dining, and relaxation. They did, but they insisted I join them every step of the way. It was clear they hadn't even been in their room for 5 minutes before my phone rang. "Gavin O'Connor," I answered again. "Mijo, when are you coming to see us?" Mrs. Santos asked eagerly. "Hello, Mrs. Santos. How was the flight?" I inquired, trying to buy a moment to think. Good. Miguel says we need to rest for a bit, but then we're ready to go." "When will you be here?" she pressed. "I can be there in about an hour," I replied, realizing I'd have to rearrange my day. "Great, mijo. See you then," she said cheerfully before hanging up. Honestly, I hadn't planned on spending much time with the Santos during their trip. They had plenty to do, and I had a pile of work on my desk. I was figuring out how to manage my schedule when Rothschild walked in with 2 paralegals. "Gavin, I've given you some time off. You need a break. Now get out of here and don't come back for a week or you're fired," Rothschild commanded, leaving no room for argument. The paralegals quickly packed up my work and cleared my desk. "Gavin, spend time with your parents. I'll handle the rest," Rothschild said, his tone softer but firm. So I did. The Santos insisted on visiting my office, though. Rothschild, who rarely joked about work, seemed ready for us when we arrived. He gave the Santos a personal tour, introducing them as my parents. In the conference room, he spent nearly an hour talking about my work, praising my accomplishments, and treating them like royalty. It was heartwarming to see the Santos beaming with pride, especially Maria, who kept patting my hand every time someone complimented me. "We're so proud of you, mijo." The rest of the week followed the same pattern. Rothschild's influence was evident everywhere we went. I had chosen the limo, resort, restaurants, and shows based on my business connections, but Rothschild ensured we were treated like VIPs. We were welcomed by owners and directors who shared stories of how I'd helped them and offered us the best seats, wine, and service. It was impressive. Mr. and Mrs. Santos, I have to admit this week has been more eventful than I expected. I know these people, but I've never received this level of service before. My daily life is much simpler. "Gavin, it's wonderful that you have so many friends who wanted to show us how special you are. We always knew you were special, and we've always been proud to call you that." Maria couldn't finish, so Miguel stepped in. "Our son, you are who you are and always will be. You took an oath before God that made you part of our family, and you fulfilled that vow. You've been a constant in our lives since you were a baby, and we've had the honor of watching you grow into a fine man. A father couldn't ask for more. Gavin, we love you and are very proud of you." Miguel Santos had aged, but his strength was still formidable. His hug felt like he might break a rib, and moments later Maria joined in, giving me a long-awaited family moment that filled me with joy. Their visit flew by, and I was sad to see them go, but I promised to visit them soon after handling some business. Rothschild knew exactly what I needed. I returned to work motivated, and when I shared my idea, he just smiled and gave his approval. The project was small and wouldn't generate long-term income, but it was probably the most important one I'd ever undertaken. In 6 weeks, I completed almost all the title deeds, secured a buyer with full financing, and made a few key phone calls. Armed with new information, I booked a flight back to my hometown for the first time in nearly 10 years. At the airport, I met Amy and Lydia, who worked at a coffee kiosk. I overheard them talking about their broken appliances and unresponsive landlord. When Amy handed me my coffee, I gave her my card with instructions. "I overheard your conversation. I think I can help. Call the number and ask for Marcus. Tell him Gavin sent you and that you need Melvin's help. He'll take it from there. If you need help finding a new place, Marcus can assist. I've written everything on the back." As my flight was called, I added, "Don't worry about the cost. Just use the number. Good luck." Why did I offer to help them? Simple. I've seen a lot of bad landlords in real estate, and Rothschild taught me that real estate isn't a zero-sum game. The best deals benefit everyone. A few calls, a letter, and some work from a paralegal could get these girls out of a bad situation. We did pro bono work from time to time, and this was no different. I sent Marcus a quick email so he wouldn't be caught off guard when the call came. The flight to Omaha was short. I got my rental car and luggage, then drove around the city. Not much had changed, though it no longer felt like home. I passed through the Santos' neighborhood, where most houses were in disrepair except for theirs. The area had clearly been neglected. My destination was a new condominium complex with condos above retail spaces, restaurants, a theater, and stores, including a grocery store. The design was unique to the area, and everything seemed perfect. The apartment I had was brand new, with 2 bedrooms, a spacious open living area, a den, and a large balcony overlooking a park. The master suite was spa-like, with a jetted tub and a large tiled shower. The place was beautifully furnished with top-of-the-line fixtures and appliances, a few personal touches, and it would feel like home. The Santos met me for dinner at one of the restaurants, arriving on time and dressed for a night out. We had a great dinner, filled with laughter, hoping the rest of the evening would be just as enjoyable. Miguel and Maria Santos, both 67, had been married for 50 years. They were still young at heart, but showed signs of a lifetime of hard work. During our time in Las Vegas, I learned they were ready to retire, but worried about their finances and living in a neighborhood surrounded by crime and abandoned houses. My goal was to change that. As Rothschild reminded me, this is what children do for their parents. I invited the Santos back to the condo for a late-night party. When we stepped into the elevator, they looked surprised. "I didn't know this was a hotel, mijo. These rooms must be expensive." "Yeah, we need to talk about that." When I opened the apartment door, they were impressed with the room. I had asked their 7 children to describe the Santos dream home, and I made sure to cover all their preferences. Their attention then shifted to the champagne. "Are we celebrating?" "Yes, I hope so." "What's the occasion?" I popped the cork. "Your retirement and new home." I raised my glass and gestured around the room. "Oh my goodness, this is too much. We can't accept it. It's not a gift, but you'll have more than enough to buy it. Please sit down and let's discuss it." They were hesitant, but things were going well. "When we sign these documents, we'll form a partnership, the Santos Investment Group. First, we'll close on 19 properties near your house. Then we'll package those with your current home, request a zoning change, and sell them to Property Management International, which plans to build a hotel and retail space next to the new arena. We'll receive the sale proceeds within 90 days. I showed them the highlighted dollar amount on the paper. They were shocked. "This apartment is rented for the next 3 months with an option to buy. Here's the cost." I handed them another paper. "Half of the remaining profits will fund a lifetime annuity for you both, with monthly dividends." I showed them the third paper. "You'll be able to retire comfortably in your new home. I'm just offering business advice and free legal services." They wouldn't become rich, but they'd never have to work again. It was a silver parachute, and it would be enough. "Gavin, how did you manage this so quickly?" "Buying the property next to yours took some effort, but Rothschild found a buyer through his connections. A new casino is being built across the river in Iowa, so we negotiated the price based on that. The zoning change will happen with the help of our buyer's contacts on the city council. The rest is just a solid investment." Maria cried but smiled, and Miguel shook his head in disbelief. "It's a miracle, more than we could have imagined," Anne-Marie's voice echoed with genuine surprise. "No one deserves it more than you two," I replied, offering sincere congratulations. I hadn't seen or heard from Anne-Marie in 10 years. Her parents and siblings never mentioned her, and she had faded from my thoughts long ago. But when I saw her again, it was as if I had awakened from a deep sleep. I had loved her throughout my youth and early adulthood, but now I felt nothing. Our meeting was entirely coincidental. I needed to pick up a few things for an upcoming trip, and the new mall had one of my favorite stores. While browsing, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "You have great taste," Anne-Marie said, her tone a mix of surprise and nostalgia. I turned to find her looking much as I remembered, older, with a less radiant smile and a few extra pounds. She was simply a more mature version of the woman I once married. "Hi, Anne-Marie," I greeted her, not quite sure what to expect. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "I'm shopping. And you?" I responded, keeping the conversation light. "Oh, I work here now," she explained. "I meant, why are you in town?" "Just finishing up some business and visiting old friends," I answered. "Was I on your list of friends to visit?" she asked, her tone half joking but with a hint of hope. "Honestly, no," I admitted. "Oh, okay. Nice to see you, Gavin," she said, a touch of disappointment in her voice. "You too, Anne-Marie," I replied, thinking that would be the end of it. Awkward, but manageable. I didn't expect to see her again, but as I was leaving, I noticed her at the cash register. After finishing her transaction, she approached me again. "Gavin, how long will you be in town?" she asked, a bit more tentatively this time. "Maybe a few days," I replied, still unsure where this was going. "Do you think we could get together and talk, at least a little?" she asked, handing me her card. "I'll think about it," I said, taking the card but not committing to anything. I walked away without another word. I had moved on and didn't have anything more to say to her. Yet, against my better judgment, 2 nights later, I found myself sitting alone in a booth at one of my favorite bars. This was a place where Anne-Marie and I used to meet friends after work on Fridays. It felt different now. When she arrived, she was dressed up, wearing a little black dress that showed off her curves, black heels, and carefully done makeup. If she'd been a stranger, I might have bought her a drink. She looked good. I didn't stand when she slid into the booth across from me. She waited a few moments before speaking. "You lied to me," she began, her voice tinged with accusation. "And you lied to me first," I retorted, both of us knowing exactly what the other meant. She looked momentarily embarrassed before continuing. "I didn't think you'd actually leave town. I hoped we'd have a chance to talk," she confessed. "What would have been the point?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "I don't know, but I wasn't happy when you left," she admitted, her voice softening. "Well, you didn't give me a choice, so I don't feel guilty about your unhappiness," I replied, my tone blunt but honest. She seemed surprised by my frankness, but I wasn't interested in sugarcoating the past. "Gavin, I never stopped loving you, even after what I did," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I sighed, sensing that she was about to revisit old wounds. "Anne-Marie, the only good thing about our divorce was that you never lied to me, probably because I didn't give you a chance. But I won't sit here if you're going to lie now. What do you even want? Why are we sitting here? Nothing will change what happened." "But you never fought for me. You just gave up without even arguing. It was so unexpected. Why did you leave without trying? I thought you loved me." "We'll have to agree to disagree. From my view, you gave up on me without a word. You abandoned me without a chance to fix things. I just put it in writing. That was a mistake, Gavin. I made a huge mistake, and I'm sorry, okay?" Anne-Marie's voice wavered as she spoke, her eyes pleading for forgiveness. I groaned inwardly. The years apart had given me clarity, but it seemed they had left Anne-Marie clinging to delusions. "Nonsense!" I shot back, refusing to let her rewrite history. Her eyes watered, but I knew everything she said was a lie. "Just because things didn't turn out as you hoped doesn't mean you can rewrite history," I continued. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you care." "I did care, Gavin. I loved you. I still love you," she insisted, her voice thick with emotion. "You honestly believe that?" I asked, incredulous. "It's true, Gavin," she affirmed, her gaze steady. "Okay, let's explore that," I said, leaning forward. "Was it you or Michael James who decided I should be deprived of sex with my loving wife?" She looked me in the eye, a flicker of shame crossing her face, but mostly reluctance to answer. "It was him," she finally admitted. "So your endless love for me let you sleep with another man and follow his wishes, knowing it would hurt me," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Gavin, she started, but I cut her off. "How long did you wait before stopping birth control?" I demanded. "What? Well, she stammered. "You didn't accidentally get pregnant. You wanted him to father your child. When were you planning to tell me? Or were you going to pretend it was mine?" I pressed, watching her squirm. She didn't bother to answer. "Why aren't you with him? Where is he?" I asked, shifting the focus. "He didn't want me," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "His wife found out, and so did his boss. His wife divorced him, and he had to resign. He left me. I had to quit my job, too. It was too embarrassing. And I'm supposed to feel bad? Why? I asked, my tone icy. I don't know, Gavin, she said, her voice breaking. I made a mistake, got involved in something bad and couldn't stop. I know I was wrong. Can't you forgive me? I love you. I died the day you left and missed you ever since. I wanted you to come back, to give me a chance to apologize, to tell you I'd never do it again. I'm all alone, Gavin. My parents barely talk to me, my siblings avoid me, and I have no friends. I'm all alone. Anne-Marie, I forgave you a long time ago, but there's no going back, I said firmly. You have your child. He can keep you warm at night. That's cruel, Gavin, she said, her voice tinged with hurt. No more cruel than the lies you're telling me, I responded, unyielding. I'm not lying, Gavin. I want another chance. It's what I've dreamed of all these years, she pleaded. It's never going to happen, I stated, leaving no room for doubt. Why, Gavin? I know you love me. You said you always would, she reminded me, desperation creeping into her voice. I've always loved you, but that's not enough, I admitted, feeling the weight of the truth. Why not? She asked, her voice trembling. 2 reasons. First, I'm not the same person who married you. I've changed, and you don't know me anymore. I certainly don't know you if I ever did, I explained. You do know me, Gavin. I'm still the same woman you loved. So what's the second reason? She asked, clinging to hope. That's the first honest thing you've said. But here's the second reason, then a question. You wanted someone else, and I let you have him without a harsh word, because I loved you. Since I left, I've gone to law school, passed the bar, started a new career, and built a new life. But I haven't been with another woman since our last time together. So tell me, how many men have you been with while you've been pining for me? Anne-Marie couldn't even look me in the eye. You see, Anne-Marie, I knew you were telling the truth. But back then, I didn't realize that the woman I loved was a lying, cheating person. How could I ever trust you again? Why would I even want to? Give me one reason why I'd let you back into my life that wouldn't just benefit you. If you can do that, maybe we have a chance. She cried quietly as I stood up to leave. That's what I thought. Goodbye, Anne-Marie. 3 months later, I saw them again, while heading back to Omaha for business. Everything was going smoothly, and Miguel and Maria were enjoying their new home. Seeing them so happy warmed my heart. The women serving customers at the coffee kiosk giggled and smiled this time. I was deep in my phone when they called my name. Mr. O'Connor? A voice called out, catching my attention. Yes, can I help you? I responded, turning to face them. At first, I didn't recognize the 2 women, but then it clicked. Oh, right. How did it go? I asked, recalling our previous interaction. Fine, Mr. O'Connor, the brunette replied. We wanted to thank you, but we didn't know how. It's Gavin, and no thanks are necessary. I'm just glad it worked out, I said with a reassuring smile. The brunette, a pretty woman named Amy with curly hair and a friendly smile, spoke while her cousin, Lydia, a shy blonde, stood quietly beside her. As my flight was announced, I began to gather my things, preparing to board. Nice to see you both again, I said, ready to leave. Just as I was about to step away, Amy ran up and handed me a napkin with a phone number scribbled on it. We'd like to thank you properly. Will you call when you get back? She asked, her tone hopeful. Caught off guard, I simply nodded. Sure, no problem, I replied, tucking the napkin into my pocket. On big holidays, the family always gathered. Easter, Thanksgiving, Christmas, 4th of July, and Cinco de Mayo. It was unusual to ask everyone to gather in September, but that's what I did. I was surprised everyone fit into the Santos' new apartment. The space was cozy but comfortable for the gathering. They all looked at me, waiting for what I had to say. It was going to be one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Maybe they wouldn't think it was my place to speak, but it felt right. As Rothschild always said, I was following my gut. I wanted everyone here, so I only had to say this once, and you all could hear it at the same time. Being treated as a full member of this family has been one of my greatest joys. Miguel and Maria, your love and support helped me through tough times, and I'll always be grateful. But I also remember that Anne-Marie was part of this family too. She shared in the joy and pain like the rest of us. She cheated on me, and I made hard choices because of that. But she didn't cheat on any of you. A few months ago, I spoke to her for the first time in 10 years. It was a painful conversation. I said harsh things to her. But what hurt most was what she told me about all of you. So, with all due respect, I need to say this. You all need to stop being little a-holes and stop ostracizing your daughter and sister. Until she's back where she belongs, I want nothing to do with you. Mr. and Mrs. Santos, I won't contact you, and you shouldn't contact me until this nonsense is over. The shocked expressions on their faces didn't bring me any satisfaction. With those words, I walked away from my foster family, unsure if I'd ever see them again. The next year was hectic, both professionally and personally. In the office, we worked at a breakneck pace that was unsustainable. After almost 8 weeks of 14-hour days and non-stop deals, Rothschild had enough. One evening in the conference room, he let us know. That's it, I'm done. I can't stand the sight of any of you. We're closed. Everyone, get out of here and don't come back for a week. I'll pay you if I don't have to see you. Then he walked out of the building. On the first day of my mandatory break, I cleaned my apartment and discovered furniture buried under piles of papers, clothes, and takeout containers. I sorted my laundry, emptying my pockets as I went, and found the napkin with Amy's number on it. By the third day, with a clean apartment and updated closet, the napkin was still sitting on my dining room table like a centerpiece, so I decided to call. I sounded like an idiot. Hello? Amy answered the phone. Yes, can I speak to Amy, please? I stammered, suddenly feeling nervous. This is her, she replied. Oh, hi, Amy. This is Gavin O'Connor. We met at the airport. You gave me your number? I reminded her, hoping she remembered. Yes, I remember you, Gavin, she said, her tone warm and familiar. Well, I know it's short notice, but would you and Lydia like to come over for dinner tonight? I thought I'd cook for you both and hear how things went with your apartment. We got kicked out of the office for a week and I'm bored, I explained, trying to sound casual. She giggled and I felt a bit embarrassed by my rambling. Gavin, we'd love to have dinner at your apartment tonight, Amy replied enthusiastically. Fantastic. Great. Can I get your address? I asked, realizing I hadn't given her the details yet. I provided my address, feeling a bit flustered but excited. Later, when they arrived, I felt much more comfortable talking to Amy and Lydia in person. Lydia was still quiet, but she made eye contact and smiled, which was more than enough to put me at ease. This is a great apartment, Gavin. Do you host parties here often? Amy asked, looking around appreciatively. My apartment was impressive, mostly because it was part of a project Rothschild and I were working on. I had jumped at the chance to buy a 3-bedroom penthouse with a fantastic view of the Strip, but I didn't mention that I also owned the building. Actually, you're the first visitors I've had, besides my boss, I admitted. Really? No girlfriend? Amy asked, surprised. Nope. I haven't even been on a date since my divorce 10 years ago, I said casually, focusing on the meal I was preparing. Amy and Lydia sat at the kitchen island, sipping wine while I cooked. Amy asked me a lot of questions, and I enjoyed the conversation. It was refreshing to talk to someone other than my boss and coworkers. As I continued cooking, I noticed both of them staring at me in shock. What? Did I say something wrong? I asked, puzzled by their reactions. You haven't been on a date in 10 years, Gavin, Amy repeated, clearly astonished. No, I haven't. I've been busy with work and studies. Is that weird? I asked, genuinely curious. Yes, Amy said emphatically, and even Lydia nodded in agreement. Well, I guess it is kind of weird, I conceded with a shrug. Jesus, Gavin, I can't believe it, Amy said, shaking her head in disbelief. It's true. Anyway, dinner's ready. Let's eat, I said, steering the conversation back to the meal. Dinner was fun, filled with laughter. I learned that Amy was in her final year studying hospitality management, and Lydia was studying English with a focus on creative writing. They were both 22 and had been living together since they were 18 when Lydia's parents passed away. Amy mentioned that Lydia liked me and would eventually open up more. The atmosphere felt a bit electric, and I wondered if they were flirting with me. I enjoyed the attention, even if it was just in my head. At the end of the evening, both girls gave me a brief hug and kiss on the cheek before leaving, with Amy suggesting we meet again soon. I jokingly said I was free for the rest of the week, and to my surprise, they showed up the next day with a picnic basket. We ate lunch on the balcony and enjoyed the day until it got too hot. Then they left for work. They took my invitation seriously. The next evening, they returned with pizza, popcorn, and a movie. They shared the couch while I settled into my favorite chair. The following day, Amy asked if they could use the pool. I assured her I'd take care of it. When they arrived, I had keys to the pool and gym for them, along with a locker. Sometimes it's good to be in charge. They had a surprise for me, too. When they came out in their bikinis, I realized I'd need to step up my workouts. After my week off, we fell into a routine. I'd work during the day, and they'd visit a few evenings a week for dinner, a movie, or just to hang out. On weekends, we found activities to do together. They also used the gym regularly, even when I wasn't there. Rothschild loved teasing me about it. If I didn't know you so well, I'd think you were dating 2 women at the same time. Give me a break, man. We're just friends, and keep your fantasies to yourself. About 4 months into our friendship, I noticed something was off. During a quiet Friday night dinner at my place, the girls seemed unusually reserved. As dinner wrapped up, the tension was too much to ignore. "Girls, is something wrong?" "No, not really." Lydia hesitated, then spoke. "Amy wants to ask you something, but we're not sure how to phrase it." "Amy, you can ask me anything. I have no filter with you two. Just ask, and I promise not to be offended by my answer." Amy took a deep breath. "Why haven't you ever made a move on us? Don't you find us attractive?" I was caught off guard and took a moment to collect myself. "You're both stunningly beautiful, but I haven't made a move for 2 reasons. First, I don't want to ruin our friendship or make you think I'm some old guy hanging around for kicks. Second, I'm not even sure I know how to make a move. I've never had the chance." Amy and Lydia exchanged a glance. Then Amy continued. "Gavin, we really enjoy spending time with you, and we both like you a lot. I like spending time with you too. But Lydia and I are looking for someone special, and we want you to understand what that means. Ladies, you're both extremely attractive, and I'm sure you'll each find someone special without any problem." Lydia seemed like she wanted to say something, but Amy pressed on. "Gavin, we don't want to find 2 separate special people. We want one. And we think that person might be, well, you." I was stunned. Before I could respond, Amy added, "We want you to understand what we're asking. Lydia wants you to read some of her work tonight. We think it'll help you understand what we're looking for. Then we can talk tomorrow about what this means for all of us. Can you do that?" "I think I can. You just want me to read her stories?" "Yes, Gavin, and then we'll talk." I realize this might give you the wrong impression of me. I have strong beliefs about right and wrong, and I treat the people I care about with kindness and respect. I believe in live and let live, as long as no one is getting hurt. However, I can also be tough when necessary, especially in business. Rothschild called it my Jekyll and Hyde quality, giving people a head start but not hesitating to retaliate if crossed. I wasn't like this before Anne-Marie broke my heart. Her betrayal made me fiercely loyal to those I trust and ruthless to those who betray me. For a long time after the divorce, I had little interest in romance. The pain of the divorce consumed me, and anything that reminded me of Anne-Marie was unbearable. I coped by focusing on my studies and work. It took years for the pain to fade. I had missed out on a lot of life experiences because I met the love of my life so young. I had never asked a girl out, never had a one-night stand, and didn't know how to attract someone. Fear of rejection held me back. I was confident in many things, but thanks to Anne-Marie, I felt insecure about relationships. 10 years passed, and I began to think I'd never get the chance to try something new. With that mindset, I read Lydia's stories. They were beautifully written, full of vivid imagery and well-drawn characters. I learned a lot about Lydia from her writing. The next day, the girls arrived around noon. I was worried I might ruin our friendship. After getting drinks and snacks, we settled in the living room. Amy got straight to the point. "Lydia and I aren't involved with each other sexually." "Okay, that's important to know, but honestly, I hadn't thought about it." Lydia smiled as Amy continued. "We've always looked out for each other. We're not just cousins, we're best friends. When we started getting interested in boys, we'd talk about what we liked and what we wanted. I've always been drawn to sweet, caring guys, while Lydia has been attracted to more assertive alpha types. The guys she dated were great in bed, but often treated her poorly on dates. Even though I understood her attraction, I didn't want her to get hurt." They sat together, holding hands. Then our worst fears came true. One of Lydia's boyfriends became too aggressive, and a few weeks later she found out she was pregnant. The pregnancy didn't go well, and they had to terminate it for her health. Complications arose, and Lydia can't have children. Tears filled their eyes. We had always dreamed of our children playing together. We were only 19, and that dream ended before it could start. But I love Lydia more than a cousin, more than a friend. We decided our dream didn't have to end. We would share my children and raise them together as co-mothers. They looked at me, gauging my reaction. I was moved by Amy's selflessness. It was one of the saddest, kindest, and most beautiful stories I'd ever heard. They smiled softly. But then we had another problem, finding the right person. The guys I liked were too weak for Lydia, and the ones she liked were too arrogant for me. We needed someone special, kind, yet confident. And then we met you, Lydia whispered, speaking to me for the first time. My heart raced. Amy continued, "You helped us without asking for anything in return. It was one of the nicest things anyone had done for us. As we got to know you, we realized you might be the one we were looking for. We decided to be honest with you, even if it meant risking our friendship." I was stunned, realizing I'd been offered a life with both of them. This is a lot to take in. I need some time to think. Can we take a break and talk more over the weekend? Of course, Gavin, we understand, Amy replied, and they left quickly. I already knew my answer, but wanted to give them a thoughtful response. They had shared something deeply personal, and I wanted to respond in kind. Later that afternoon, I ran some errands, then returned to my apartment and sent a text to Lydia before calling Amy. "Hello?" Amy answered. "Hi, Amy, it's Gavin. I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me tonight," I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. In the background, I could hear Lydia's phone ringing, followed by her surprised sigh. "Gavin, I'd love to have dinner tonight," Amy replied warmly. "Great, I'll pick you up at 7 o'clock, I said, feeling a sense of anticipation. After I hung up, I waited for Lydia's response. The message I had sent her was riskier. "Be at my place at 6:15. Don't be late. You'll be staying the night." Her reply came quickly and simply. Perfect. When I arrived to pick up Amy, I was momentarily speechless. She looked stunning in a little black dress. I handed her a bouquet of white lilies. "Wow, you look amazing," I said, genuinely impressed. "Thank you, Gavin, for the flowers and the compliment," she responded with a smile. Our evening was romantic. We shared wine and sushi at one of her favorite restaurants, then went to a nightclub for drinks. We talked about our dreams, future plans, kids, and family. By the end of the night, we had bonded deeply. As we walked through a park holding hands, I couldn't shake a lingering worry. "What's bothering you, Gavin?" Amy asked, sensing my unease. "Why me, Amy? I'm over 10 years older than you, divorced, and every eye was on you tonight. You could have anyone," I confessed, my insecurity slipping out. "Gavin, you'll figure it out soon. But for tonight, can you accept that you're the one? There's no one else for me," she reassured me. "Yes, I can live with that. Thank you for a wonderful evening, Amy," I said, feeling more at ease. "No, Gavin, thank you," she replied, squeezing my hand. On Easter Sunday, I found myself in my old church, feeling out of place. I had converted to Catholicism to marry Anne Marie and was a faithful parishioner during our marriage. But it felt strange to be there again. I'd been sitting alone for about 15 minutes when someone sat down next to me. "This seems like a good place for confession. Forgive me, Gavin, for I have sinned," Anne-Marie said, breaking the silence. "Anne-Marie, I forgave you a long time ago," I replied, turning to face her. "I know, Gavin, but you forgave me when I didn't deserve it, when I wasn't even sorry. Now I understand the pain I caused you. I wish I could take it all back. I always thought you deserved someone better. I'm so sorry I couldn't be the woman you deserved. Thank you for giving me my family back. My dad told me it was because of you." "Thank you, Anne-Marie. I appreciate your apology. You're always welcome." Mass went well, and Easter brunch was enjoyable. But as the day went on, I realized there was no longer a place for me in the Santos family. It was time to move on. When it was time to leave, there were tearful goodbyes. Maria Santos hugged me at the door, understanding more than she said. She placed her hand on my cheek, closed her eyes for a moment, and then whispered, "God bless you, Micho. I will miss you." My personal life was far from normal. For months, Amy, Lydia, and I had settled into an unusual pattern, spending most of our time together as a close-knit trio. If they had lived with me full-time, we might have spent only a few hours more together each week. I was very happy dating Amy, though our relationship hadn't progressed beyond kissing. She believed we'd both know when the time was right, and I agreed. The oddest part was that she had no problem making me tense and then sending me to Lydia for relief. Lydia, for her part, blossomed under this arrangement. Amy told me that Lydia had thought I was perfect from the start. Lydia needed guidance, which made her feel safe and cared for, and I gradually took over that role from Amy. The turning point was the flowers. I hadn't thought much about giving them flowers, but it felt right. I gave Amy flowers on our first date and at random moments because it was romantic. Lydia's flowers were a thank you, delivered separately due to circumstances. My first date with Amy was wonderful, but as I returned to Lydia, I worried I wouldn't meet her needs. I needn't have worried. Over the next few months, I thought a lot about how to win Lydia over, but that first night, instinct took over. When Lydia walked in with the biggest smile, holding her flowers, I knew I'd done the right thing. As I left Omaha for the last time, I felt a deep satisfaction. I had survived Anne-Marie's betrayal, started a new life, and built a career. But something was still missing: real happiness. On the way home, I made a stop, bought 2 things, and quickly returned. When I got home, Amy and Lydia were happy to see me, and we had a light, fun dinner together. I hoped to make our lives even better. After dinner, as they cleaned up in the kitchen, I watched them working together, enjoying the task simply because they were together. "I know why we haven't had sex," I said. Lydia turned to look at me, while Amy kept her eyes on the sink. "When we make love for the first time, it will be to create life, to share a piece of ourselves for a common purpose. That's why we'll be together. But there's an even more important reason. You'll be giving Lydia and me something we can't get on our own. A child." Lydia smiled through her tears. "I think you've been waiting for me to realize this, and you've waited long enough." I knelt down and pulled out a box. Lydia began to jump with excitement as I opened it. Amy slowly turned, tears in her eyes. "Amy, will you marry me?" "Yes, Gavin, I will. I'll love you forever and give you everything I have." Amy and Lydia hugged first, showing how close they were and how much we all needed each other. I slipped the ring onto Amy's finger, and Lydia admired it. "That's a beautiful ring, Gavin. You're not left out, Lydia. You're a vital part of our lives." I pulled out a second box containing an ankle bracelet with a diamond set in a Celtic knot with 3 birthstones: ruby, sapphire, and amethyst. "Lydia, we love you and need you. Please don't ever leave us." Amy was crying, but Lydia was calm as I fastened the bracelet around her ankle. "I'm home, Gavin. I'm not going anywhere." We were married 3 months later in a small ceremony with Lydia beside Amy and Rothschild next to me. 6 months later, Aidan James O'Connor was born. Twins Sophia Marie and Stephen Michael followed, and then baby Olivia Rose. The boys looked like me. Sophia was a tiny version of Amy, and Olivia was a clone of Lydia. Their bond was instant and unbreakable. Were Amy and I jealous that Olivia treated Lydia like her only parent while we were like a beloved aunt and uncle? Not at all. Amy and I lived as husband and wife, but Lydia was always close. My journey to happiness took time, but I found my place again. Our life together was as perfect as any relationship could be. I loved Amy, Lydia, and our children. Amy loved me, Lydia, and the kids. Lydia loved Amy, needed me, and gave our children a mother's love. We've never shared our lifestyle publicly, and only our closest friends know the truth. But we live a very happy life together.